At its height, the British Empire governed nearly a quarter of the world's land and population, an empire so vast that its leaders claimed the sun never set upon it. Yet its rise was anything but inevitable. How did a small island off the coast of Europe, often divided at home and outmatched by continental powers, come to dominate oceans, continents, and centuries of global history? This is the story of how trade became conquest, how colonies became nations, and how an empire that reshaped the modern world ultimately unraveled. When Henry VII took the throne in the late 15th century, England was not yet a seafaring empire. It was a recovering kingdom, scarred by decades of civil war, isolated from continental politics, and far behind Spain and Portugal in the race for overseas discovery. Yet, within just over a century, England would begin to imagine itself as a maritime power, sending ships into distant waters and planting the first seeds of what would one day become the British Empire. The Tudor period marks that crucial transformation, from a cautious island monarchy into a kingdom curious about the wider world. It did not happen through grand imperial design, but through a series of tentative ventures, commercial experiments, and moments of opportunism that slowly pushed English horizons outward. In 1497, the Venetian navigator John Cabot sailed from Bristol under a commission from Henry VII. Cabot's small ship, the Matthew, crossed the North Atlantic and made landfall somewhere along the coast of what is now Canada, perhaps Newfoundland. It was a brief, uncertain voyage, but a symbolic one. Cabot claimed the land for England, believing he had reached Asia. In truth, he had encountered the edges of a continent Europeans barely understood. His discoveries did not lead to permanent settlement, yet they gave England a legitimate claim to lands in the New World, claims that would be revived a century later. Cabot's expedition was driven not by royal ambition, but by trade. Bristol merchants hoped to find new routes for fishing and commerce. Henry VII, cautious with his treasury, offered limited backing but great rewards if the venture succeeded. This blend of private enterprise and royal license became a defining feature of English expansion. Unlike the Spanish or Portuguese, who built empires through direct royal control, the English favored charters, companies, and private initiative, a habit that would shape the empire's structure for centuries. Through the early 16th century, however, England lagged behind. Spain, under Ferdinand and Isabella, and later Charles V, conquered vast territories in the Americas. Portugal established routes to India, Africa, and the Far East. English monarchs, preoccupied with dynastic security and religious upheaval, played little part in the Age of Discovery. That began to change under Henry VIII. His reign saw the founding of a modern navy, not yet an imperial fleet, but a defensive one. The break with Rome in the 1530s also shifted England's international position. Isolated from Catholic Europe, the kingdom looked increasingly toward trade and the sea to assert itself. Privateers, merchants, and fishermen began to venture farther, though their reach remained modest. The reign of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, transformed these tentative movements into something larger. By the middle of the 16th century, England faced a rapidly changing world. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas had made Spain the dominant European power. Spanish galleons carried unimaginable wealth from Mexico and Peru. English observers were fascinated and envious. Writers like Richard Hakluyt urged their country to join the global enterprise to seek Western planting and overseas trade as the key to national greatness. Elizabeth's government was cautious but pragmatic. She granted royal charters to groups of merchants, allowing them to explore, trade, and sometimes colonize on the crown's behalf. The Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, sought routes through Russia to reach Asia. The Levant Company, established later, opened trade with the Ottoman Empire. These early corporations were not colonial in the modern sense. They were commercial networks tied together by profit, diplomacy, and chartered privilege. Yet they laid the groundwork for England's global economy. At the same time, English seamen began to test Spain's monopoly of the Atlantic. Figures like John Hawkins and Francis Drake blurred the line between piracy and policy. Hawkins made his fortune trading enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, a grim and violent business that would later grow into a central pillar of the empire's wealth. Drake, meanwhile, became a national hero for his daring raids against Spanish ports and his circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580. Elizabeth herself secretly invested in his voyages and famously knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, upon his return. These exploits carried both risk and message. They announced that England, though still small, could challenge the great powers on the high seas. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was the clearest symbol of that change. Though largely defensive, the victory confirmed the growing strength of England's navy and the vulnerability of Spain's empire. Beneath the surface, other changes were taking place. England's population was rising, and its economy was shifting from feudal agriculture to market production. Many small farmers were displaced by the enclosure of common lands. Religious conflict, after decades of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, created restless groups eager to seek new beginnings abroad. The idea of colonization, once a distant fantasy, began to seem both practical and desirable. In the 1580, Sir Humphrey Gilbert received a royal patent to establish colonies in North America. His first attempt ended in disaster, with his ship lost at sea. His half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, carried on the dream. In 1585, Raleigh sponsored the first English settlement on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The colony mysteriously vanished within a few years, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a tree. The failure discouraged further colonization for a time, but it did not extinguish the vision. The idea that English people could settle and build new societies overseas had taken hold. Throughout the late 16th century, England's overseas ventures were still experimental, part exploration, part piracy, part trade. Yet collectively, they shifted national identity. The English began to see themselves as a maritime people, with a destiny tied to the ocean. The language of exploration entered popular culture, celebrated in plays, pamphlets, and maps. Writers spoke of planting English civilization abroad, of spreading Protestant faith and lawful government to counter Spanish Catholic dominance. Religion and rivalry often overlapped. The Reformation made empire not only an economic project, but a moral and spiritual one. To many English thinkers, Spain's Catholic Empire represented tyranny and corruption, while English colonization promised liberty and reform. In practice, the motives were mixed. Profit, glory, and faith all played their parts. But the ideological contrast between free Englishmen and oppressive Spaniards would persist throughout the empire's later justifications. The close of Elizabeth's reign brought both consolidation and uncertainty. The monarchy had survived invasion, religious tension, and financial strain. England had no permanent colonies, yet it possessed a strong navy, ambitious merchants, and growing global awareness. When Elizabeth died in 1603 and James VI of Scotland became James I of England, he inherited a realm ready to look outward with new purpose. When James I ascended the English throne in 1603, he inherited a kingdom eager for direction. The Tudor century had kindled curiosity about the wider world, but the foundations of empire were still uncertain. England had no lasting colonies, no steady overseas income, and no clear policy for expansion. What it did have was an energetic community of merchants, navigators, and investors who were ready to turn the lessons of Elizabeth's age into structured ventures. The dawn of the 17th century was an age of companies, organizations created by royal charter that combined private investment with limited state oversight. These early joint stock companies became the engines of English overseas growth. Their purpose was simple in theory but ambitious in scope: to find profitable trade routes, compete with foreign powers, and sometimes to plant permanent settlements. The model allowed the crown to extend its reach without direct expense. while investors shared both risk and reward. Among the earliest and most influential was the East India Company, granted its charter in the final days of Elizabeth's reign in December 1600. The company's investors, wealthy merchants and courtiers, sought to break into the spice trade that had long been dominated by Portugal and, increasingly, by the Netherlands. The charter gave the company a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and authority to make treaties, build forts, and maintain armed ships. It was not yet an empire in itself, but it carried within it the DNA of one. In 1601, the company dispatched its first fleet under Captain James Lancaster. The voyage was perilous and slow, but by 1602, the English ships reached Sumatra and established a trading post at Bantam in Java. They returned home with pepper and spices, yielding a substantial profit. The venture proved that long-distance trade with Asia was possible and profitable, and that private capital could achieve what royal power alone could not. At the same time, attention was turning westward. The memory of the lost Roanoke colony still lingered, but new investors were convinced that North America held promise. It was not gold or silver they sought. England lacked the resources for conquest on the Spanish scale, but land, trade, and a chance to relieve social pressures at home. The population of England had been growing, and economic change had left many without secure livelihoods. Colonization offered opportunity for some, and hope for investors that new commodities might enrich the realm. In 1606, James I granted 2 charters for colonization in North America, one to the London Company, later known as the Virginia Company, and another to the Plymouth Company. Each was assigned a portion of territory along the Atlantic coast. The companies were expected to fund and manage settlements under the broad authority of the Crown. This approach, corporate colonization, reflected the English habit of delegating empire to private enterprise. The Virginia Company's expedition in 1607 would mark the first enduring English foothold in the Americas. 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, carried about 100 settlers across the Atlantic. After 4 months at sea, they sailed up a broad river in what is now Virginia and chose a site for settlement, naming it Jamestown in honor of the king. The challenges that followed were immediate and severe. The colonists, many of them gentlemen unaccustomed to labor, struggled with disease, hunger, and conflict with local Powhatan peoples. The first years brought near catastrophe. By 1610, only a fraction of the original settlers remained alive. The colony survived largely through the leadership of Captain John Smith, who enforced discipline and negotiated uneasy trade with the Powhatan Confederacy. His famous association with Pocahontas, daughter of the Powhatan leader Wahan-Senecau, became one of the enduring legends of early America, though the realities were far more complex and often tense. The Virginia Company faced financial strain, but it persisted. The arrival of new settlers and supplies helped stabilize the colony, and an unexpected breakthrough transformed its prospects. In 1612, John Rolfe successfully cultivated tobacco from Caribbean seed, producing a variety suitable for European markets. Within a few years, tobacco exports turned Jamestown from an economic failure into a profitable venture. This new cash crop, however, demanded labor, initially from English indentured servants who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage and the promise of land. The system created a new social order in the colony, a class of landowners dependent on imported labor. By the 1620s, the first Africans were brought to Virginia, marking the beginning of a racialized labor system that would later define much of the Atlantic world. While Virginia struggled and then survived, the Plymouth Company's northern attempt fared poorly. An expedition in 1607 failed to establish a settlement in what is now Maine, and the project was abandoned. Yet the pattern of experimentation continued. English fishermen frequented the coasts of Newfoundland and New England, while merchants probed opportunities from the Caribbean to West Africa. These ventures were part of a broader transformation in English thinking. Colonization was no longer merely a patriotic or religious ideal. It was an economic system tied to global trade. The Virginia Company issued shares, published promotional pamphlets, and appealed to the public for investment. Ordinary citizens in London could now own a stake in an overseas colony, linking the fortunes of empire to those of the middle class. This democratization of risk and profit would become a hallmark of British imperial expansion. The Crown benefited as well. Colonies extended royal influence, offered new sources of customs revenue, and provided strategic bases against European rivals. Yet James I himself remained ambivalent. He distrusted the unruly independence of the Virginia Company and the religious dissenters it occasionally attracted. Nonetheless, the precedent was set. Overseas territories could be founded and managed by corporate enterprise under the distant authority of the monarch. In the same period, English trade networks expanded elsewhere. The East India Company established additional factories or trading posts in Surat, on the western coast of India, and later in places such as Madras and Calcutta. These outposts were small and dependent on local rulers, but they laid the foundations for a growing presence in Asia. English ships also reached Persia and Japan, seeking markets beyond the reach of Iberian control. What made these companies effective was not just their ambition, but their structure. Investors were protected from total ruin because risk was shared among many. Managers abroad were incentivized to secure local alliances and profits, since the Crown offered little direct aid. The companies became miniature states, issuing their own regulations, negotiating treaties, and occasionally waging war. This fusion of commerce and governance would become the essence of Britain's later imperial style. Meanwhile, the experiences in Virginia prompted political innovation. The settlers demanded a voice in their affairs, arguing that Englishmen abroad retained the same rights as those at home. In 1619, the Virginia Company authorized the creation of a local assembly, the House of Burgesses, the first representative body in English America. It was a modest beginning, but it planted the idea that colonies could be governed by law and consent rather than royal decree. That same year brought two other developments that would echo through history: the arrival of the first recorded Africans in Virginia and the landing of English women intended for marriage and settlement. Together, these events marked the transition from a precarious outpost to a self-reproducing community, one shaped by race, labor, and family in ways that would define the future of English America. The Virginia Company itself, however, struggled with debt and mismanagement. Investors grew restless, and reports of famine and conflict discouraged further funding. The Powhatan War of 1622, in which indigenous forces killed hundreds of settlers, exposed the colony's fragility. Blame fell on the company's leadership, and in 1624 the Crown revoked its charter, bringing Virginia under direct royal control. It became a royal colony, governed by officials appointed from London. This moment was more than a bureaucratic change. It marked a shift in imperial logic. The experiment of purely corporate colonization had reached its limit. The state began to assume greater responsibility for security and administration, recognizing that colonies were not only commercial assets, but instruments of national power. By the time James I died in 1625, England had taken its first uncertain steps into global empire. It possessed a thriving, if still fragile, colony in Virginia, a network of Asian trading posts, and a growing merchant class tied to overseas investment. The nation's identity was beginning to change. The sea was no longer a boundary, but a highway, and England's prosperity increasingly depended on what happened far beyond its shores. By the middle of the 17th century, England had begun to recognize that its growing colonies and trade networks required a guiding hand from the state. The early decades of exploration and company ventures had produced valuable experience, but also confusion and rivalry. Merchants, planters, and seamen all sought profit, yet their interests often collided. The Crown and Parliament now turned to law, to legislation, as the means of building a coherent empire. The result was a series of policies that historians call the Navigation Acts, beginning in 1651. These acts were not military conquests or territorial annexations. They were pieces of economic engineering designed to shape the movement of goods and money across the Atlantic. The aim was clear: to ensure that trade from England's colonies benefited England itself, not its European competitors. The first Navigation Act, passed under Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth government, required that all goods imported into England or its colonies be carried on English ships or on ships from the producing country. This meant that Dutch merchants, who had dominated much of Europe's carrying trade, could no longer act as middlemen for English goods. The measure struck directly at the wealth of the Dutch Republic, which had become the commercial hub of 17th-century Europe. The logic behind the act was mercantilist. In this worldview, wealth was finite, measured in bullion and trade balance. A nation could prosper only if it kept the flow of commerce and money within its own orbit. Colonies were to supply raw materials and serve as captive markets, while the mother country manufactured goods and controlled shipping. In practice, the policy tied England's colonies ever more tightly to the metropolitan economy. The Dutch, unsurprisingly, resisted. The new laws helped trigger the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. English and Dutch fleets clashed across the North Sea and the Channel, as each side sought to protect its commercial lifelines. The English Navy, reorganized and professionalized under the Commonwealth, proved its strength. By 1654, the Treaty of Westminster confirmed England's new maritime status. Though the two nations would fight again, the balance of power at sea had shifted. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles II inherited both the navy and the mercantile vision that had grown during the civil wars. The Crown and Parliament soon renewed and expanded the Navigation Acts. New statutes in 1660 and 1673 required that certain valuable colonial goods, tobacco, sugar, indigo, and later rice and cotton, be exported only to England or its colonies. Imports to the colonies, likewise, had to pass through English ports where duties could be collected. These measures did more than protect English merchants. They created an integrated imperial economy. Caribbean sugar, Virginia tobacco, and New England timber were all drawn into a single system centered on London. Customs officials were appointed to enforce the rules, and colonial governors were expected to report regularly to the Board of Trade. The empire was still far from centralized, but it was beginning to operate under common legislation and oversight. The impact of these policies was uneven. For English merchants and shipbuilders, they were a boon. The laws guaranteed steady employment for English ships and sailors, expanding the maritime industry that would one day dominate the world's oceans. London, Bristol, and other ports flourished. Insurance, banking, and warehousing developed to support the flow of goods. For the colonies, the effects were more complex. In the Chesapeake, planters resented the restrictions that forced them to sell tobacco only to English buyers, but they also benefited from the secure market that the acts provided. In New England, the shipbuilding industry thrived on the demand for vessels that met English registry requirements. In the Caribbean, sugar planters gained protection from foreign competition, though their profits increasingly depended on enslaved labor. The enforcement of these acts also created the machinery of imperial bureaucracy. Customs houses were established in colonial ports, and royal officers began to appear more regularly in what had once been self-governing settlements. The seeds of future tension were planted here, as colonists learned to balance local autonomy with imperial regulation. Smuggling became a widespread response, blurring the lines between legal and illicit trade. Beyond the Atlantic, England's global ambitions continued to grow. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1660 by Charles II, became the chief instrument of English trade along the West African coast. Its purpose was to secure gold, ivory, and, most lucratively, enslaved Africans for sale in the Americas. The company's emblem, an elephant and a castle, symbolized both commerce and power. Ships sailed from London and Bristol laden with goods to exchange for captives, who were then transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions to labor on plantations in the Caribbean and North America. This triangular trade bound together three continents, manufactured goods from Europe, enslaved labor from Africa, and colonial produce from the Americas. The profits were immense, feeding England's financial growth and strengthening its navy. The moral cost was catastrophic, but at the time, few in power questioned the system. The integration of slave labor into imperial commerce made England's Atlantic Empire one of the most productive and exploitative economic machines in history. Wars continued to shape this commercial world. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, from 1665 to 1667, saw fierce naval battles in which both sides suffered heavy losses. During the conflict, an English fleet captured the Dutch colony of New Netherland in North America. Renamed New York in honor of the king's brother, the Duke of York, it became a vital link between New England and the southern colonies. This conquest gave England control of nearly the entire Atlantic seaboard, consolidating its presence in North America. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, in the early 1670s, ended inconclusively, but by then the Dutch commercial advantage was waning. The English Navy, supported by new dockyards and regular taxation, had become a permanent force. England's merchant fleet was now among the largest in Europe, and the Navigation Acts had turned trade into an instrument of national policy. In the Caribbean, England's holdings expanded as well. The capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655 proved decisive. Within a few decades, the island's sugar plantations made it one of the most profitable colonies in the empire. The wealth generated there depended entirely on enslaved labor, supplied in growing numbers by the Royal African Company. Jamaica's port at Port Royal became notorious for its mixture of piracy, trade, and vice, a symbol of the rough edges of imperial capitalism. The Restoration era also saw new experiments in colonization. Proprietary colonies such as Carolina and Pennsylvania were founded under charters granted to individual nobles or entrepreneurs. These ventures combined royal favor with private initiative, echoing the corporate spirit of earlier companies but under closer royal supervision. Colonial society grew increasingly diverse as settlers arrived from across the British Isles and from continental Europe. At home, the Navigation Acts and the growing imperial economy transformed England itself. The customs revenue collected from trade helped finance the navy and the crown. Dockyards at Deptford, Portsmouth, and Chatham expanded, employing thousands of shipwrights and sailors. Maritime towns grew, and a new middle class of merchants and investors began to wield political influence. Empire was becoming a shared national project, not merely the pursuit of adventurers. The emerging connection between commerce and military power was especially important. Control of trade routes required naval protection, and naval victories in turn secured commercial supremacy. This feedback loop, trade funding fleets, fleets protecting trade, would define British global strategy for centuries. The Navigation Acts thus laid not only an economic foundation but a geopolitical one. By the early 18th century, the Atlantic world had been reshaped. England's rivals recognized that its economic strength no longer depended solely on land or treasure, but on regulation and shipping. The empire was, in effect, being legislated into existence. Colonies, companies, and commerce were now parts of a single system sustained by law, taxation, and armed force. Yet these achievements carried hidden strains. The very policies that enriched England also restricted colonial freedom. Merchants in New England chafed under customs inspections. Planters in the Caribbean complained of taxes and price controls. Some even looked for ways to trade secretly with French or Dutch neighbors. The empire's unity depended on constant negotiation and enforcement, a delicate balance that could not always hold. By the later 17th century, England's growing Atlantic empire was being reshaped by a brutal and far-reaching system, the trade in enslaved Africans. What had begun as an experiment in maritime commerce and colonial settlement now evolved into an integrated network of exploitation that connected West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American mainland. This transformation gave the empire enormous wealth and global influence, but it was built on forced labor and human suffering on a scale that would scar generations. The economic expansion of the Restoration era had created a voracious demand for labor. England's Caribbean colonies, especially Barbados and Jamaica, had discovered that sugar could be more valuable than gold. Producing it, however, required a constant and disciplined workforce. Early attempts to rely on European indentured servants proved unsustainable. Mortality was high, and most servants eventually demanded land or freedom. Planters soon turned to the transatlantic slave trade as a more permanent, though far more inhumane, solution. To control and profit from this trade, the Crown granted charters to a series of companies. The most powerful of these was the Royal African Company, established in 1660 under the patronage of the Duke of York, who would later become King James II. Its charter gave it exclusive rights to trade along the West African coast, particularly for gold and enslaved people. The company built a chain of forts and factories from the Gambia River to the Gold Coast, including strongholds such as Cape Coast Castle, which became a central hub for the capture and shipment of Africans. The company's operations were extensive. English ships carried textiles, metal goods, and weapons from home ports to Africa. There, these goods were exchanged, often violently, for men, women, and children captured through warfare or raids by African intermediaries. The captives were then transported across the Atlantic in what came to be known as the Middle Passage. Conditions aboard the ships were horrific: overcrowded holds, rampant disease, and brutal punishment for resistance. Many perished before ever reaching the Americas. Those who survived were sold in Caribbean markets, where planters competed for new laborers to sustain their sugar estates. From there, colonial ships carried sugar, rum, and molasses back to England, completing what merchants called the triangular trade. Every leg of this circuit produced profit for investors and revenue for the Crown, binding together distant regions into a single extractive system. By the end of the 17th century, the scale of this trade had grown enormously. Tens of thousands of Africans were being transported annually in English ships. The profits helped finance docks, warehouses, and insurance companies in ports such as London, Bristol, and Liverpool. Even smaller coastal towns became tied to the trade through shipbuilding, rope-making, and other maritime industries. The wealth generated by slavery thus reached deep into the British economy, touching merchants, bankers, and consumers alike. In the Caribbean, the plantation system hardened into a social order based entirely on race and coercion. African laborers were legally defined as property. Colonial assemblies, dominated by white planters, passed slave codes that stripped enslaved people of all rights and imposed harsh penalties for resistance or escape. The codes also institutionalized racial hierarchy, creating a class of free whites above enslaved blacks, with small groups of free people of color occupying a precarious middle ground. On the plantations, life was governed by relentless cycles of labor and punishment. Enslaved workers toiled long hours in the cane fields, cutting and processing sugar under the supervision of overseers. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Accidents, disease, and malnutrition were common, and mortality rates were appallingly high. Planters often chose to import new captives rather than maintain existing populations, treating human lives as expendable commodities. Yet, even within this oppressive world, enslaved Africans resisted and adapted in countless ways. They formed families, practiced religion, preserved music and language, and occasionally rebelled. Maroon communities, groups of escaped slaves, established independent settlements in the mountains and forests of islands such as Jamaica and Suriname, defying colonial control for decades. Resistance, both overt and subtle, became a defining feature of the plantation world. The influence of the Caribbean economy soon extended to the North American colonies. In the Carolinas, planters learned rice cultivation techniques from enslaved Africans who had brought agricultural knowledge from West Africa. In Virginia and Maryland, the gradual shift from indentured labor to African slavery transformed social relations. By the early 18th century, slavery had become the backbone of British America's agricultural economy from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake. Meanwhile, in Africa, the effects of the trade were devastating. The demand for captives fueled wars and destabilized entire regions. African states such as Dahomey and the Asante Kingdom rose to prominence by supplying captives to European traders, while others collapsed under the strain of violence and depopulation. The coastal forts of the Royal African Company became centers of conflict, diplomacy, and exploitation. For every merchant who profited in London, thousands in Africa paid with their freedom or their lives. Despite its initial monopoly, the Royal African Company soon faced growing competition. Independent traders, known as interlopers, challenged its exclusive rights. They argued that free trade would increase profits for England as a whole. Parliament eventually agreed, and in 1698 it opened the slave trade to private enterprise. This change unleashed a flood of English and, later, British merchants into the Atlantic system. The traffic in enslaved people intensified, and the wealth it generated spread more widely across society. As profits increased, so did the scale of investment. Wealth from the slave trade financed new industries in England. The ironworks that produced shackles and tools, the textile mills that manufactured trade goods, and the refineries that processed Caribbean sugar. The flow of silver and commodities into the economy helped stabilize the monarchy after the turmoil of the 17th century and funded the wars that secured Britain's growing global position. By the early 18th century, London had become one of the major financial centers of Europe, and much of its capital rested on the labor of enslaved Africans. Elegant townhouses, universities, and public works were often funded by families with interests in plantations or shipping. The moral contradictions of this wealth were rarely confronted. Writers and politicians spoke proudly of liberty and Protestant virtue, while the empire's prosperity depended on human bondage. Nevertheless, voices of dissent began to emerge. Some religious groups, particularly the Quakers, condemned the trade as incompatible with Christian morality. Their protests were small and often ignored, but they laid the foundations for the abolitionist movements of the next century. In the meantime, the plantation complex continued to expand, supplying sugar, coffee, and other tropical goods to Europe's growing consumer markets. The connection between slavery and imperial power was also military. The Royal Navy protected shipping lanes and suppressed rival traders, while colonial militias defended plantations against rebellion. The Navy's presence in the Caribbean served not only to deter European enemies, but also to enforce discipline among the enslaved population. Control of the seas ensured control of labor, and control of labor ensured the flow of wealth to Britain. This economic and strategic system made Britain one of the preeminent powers of the 18th century. The empire's ports buzzed with ships carrying goods, people, and ideas. Sugar sweetened the tea of every household, and tobacco filled the pipes of every tavern. These comforts masked the human cost behind them. Every spoonful of sugar, every pound of tobacco, carried within it the labor of enslaved hands and the suffering of distant lives. By the turn of the century, Britain's imperial economy had become inseparable from the transatlantic slave system. The profits financed wars against France, underwrote colonial expansion, and sustained the government's credit. In this period, the empire was not merely a collection of territories. It was a network of trade routes, plantations, and financial institutions bound together by the movement of enslaved bodies and commodities. The moral reckoning would come later. For now, slavery was seen not as a moral question, but as an economic necessity. Politicians defended it as vital to national prosperity, and many intellectuals justified it through racial theories that claimed Europeans were destined to rule. These ideas, combined with economic self-interest, would make the institution of slavery remarkably durable, surviving well into the 19th century before its eventual abolition. By the closing decades of the 17th century, England's overseas empire had expanded dramatically in wealth and reach. Yet at home, the political foundations of that empire were unstable. Civil war, religious conflict, and the struggles between monarch and parliament had defined much of the century. Out of these crises emerged a revolution that would transform not only England's domestic politics, but also the structure of its empire. Between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the end of the War of the Spanish Succession in 1714, England remade itself into a powerful, centralized, and financially sophisticated state, capable of sustaining global wars and managing a far-flung imperial system. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 began as a domestic conflict but had worldwide consequences. When James II, the Catholic brother of Charles II, attempted to restore royal absolutism and religious tolerance for Catholics, he provoked widespread resistance. The birth of his son, a potential Catholic heir, alarmed much of the Protestant elite. In response, a group of English nobles invited William of Orange, the Protestant husband of James's daughter Mary, to intervene. William landed with an army, and James fled to France. Parliament then declared that the throne was vacant and offered it jointly to William and Mary, marking a constitutional turning point. The revolution was bloodless in England but violent in Ireland and Scotland, where supporters of James, known as Jacobites, resisted William's rule. The Battle of the Boyne in 1690 secured William's victory, but the conflict revealed how closely Britain's internal stability was tied to its imperial ambitions. William's new government embraced Protestantism, parliamentary supremacy, and the notion that trade and naval power were essential to national security. One of the most significant legacies of the revolution was the creation of a fiscal military state, a system capable of financing sustained warfare through taxation, borrowing, and efficient administration. Before this period, English monarchs struggled to raise revenue for prolonged conflicts. After 1688, Parliament gained control over taxation and spending, ensuring accountability but also regular funding for the Navy and Army. In 1694, the government established the Bank of England, a private institution that lent money to the state in exchange for regular interest payments guaranteed by taxes. This innovation allowed the government to borrow large sums at low interest, creating a permanent national debt that could finance military expansion. The Bank of England, the national debt, and new systems of taxation, such as excise duties, gave Britain a reliable financial foundation for empire. This transformation coincided with an age of nearly continuous warfare. The 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, pitted England and its allies against the expansionist ambitions of Louis XIV of France. The conflict stretched from Flanders to the Caribbean and North America, where English colonists fought French and indigenous forces along the frontiers. Though the war ended indecisively, it demonstrated that England could now sustain global operations. Naval power became the heart of this new system. The Royal Navy, once an intermittent force, evolved into a permanent institution with professional officers, standardized ships, and centralized command. Naval dockyards expanded at Portsmouth and Chatham, and fleets patrolled trade routes across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The ability to protect commerce and project force overseas gave England a decisive advantage over its rivals. The revolution also strengthened the relationship between commerce and government. Merchants and financiers in London now found their interests aligned with those of the state. War contracts, colonial monopolies, and loans to the treasury tied private wealth to public power. The City of London became a financial engine for imperial expansion, and its institutions, banks, insurers, and brokers, developed systems that would soon dominate global trade. Religious and political ideology reinforced this partnership. Protestant writers portrayed England as a chosen nation defending liberty and faith against Catholic tyranny embodied by France and Spain. This rhetoric justified imperial competition as both moral and divine. Colonization and commerce were now part of a broader national mission, uniting spiritual purpose with economic ambition. While England reorganized internally, it also drew its neighboring kingdoms into a new political structure. The Act of Union of 1707 united England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. The union was not purely sentimental, it was driven by calculation and necessity. Scotland, weakened by economic hardship and the failure of its colonial venture at Darien in Central America, sought access to England's expanding markets and empire. In exchange, Scottish elites accepted representation in a unified parliament. The Union created a single state with a shared economy, flag, and foreign policy. It also brought a surge of Scottish participation in imperial affairs. Scottish merchants, soldiers, and administrators would soon play major roles in India, the Caribbean, and North America. The combination of English capital and Scottish enterprise proved one of the most dynamic forces in 18th century empire building. The newly united kingdom's first great test came with the War of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701. The conflict arose when Charles II of Spain died without an heir, leaving his vast empire vulnerable. European powers feared that France, under Louis XIV, would place his grandson Philip V on the Spanish throne, creating a Franco-Spanish superpower. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire joined forces to prevent it. Under the leadership of John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, British forces achieved major victories on the continent, notably at Blenheim in 1704 and Ramillies in 1706. At sea, the Royal Navy seized strategic bases such as Gibraltar and Minorca, securing Britain's dominance in the Mediterranean. Beyond Europe, British privateers attacked Spanish and French shipping in the Caribbean, while colonial militias engaged in frontier skirmishes in North America. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714. The agreement granted Britain new territories and commercial privileges that would define its 18th century empire. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, both vital naval stations, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay region in North America, and the Asiento, an exclusive contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. This last concession extended Britain's reach deep into the global slave economy and brought enormous profits to London's merchants. The Treaty of Utrecht also marked the decline of the Dutch Republic as a major power and the rise of Britain as its successor in maritime trade. With secure access to world markets and a navy capable of protecting them, Britain emerged from the war as the leading commercial and naval power of Europe. Its empire, though still relatively small in territory, was vast in potential. Domestically, the revolution and the wars that followed transformed society. Parliament's control over finance and policy created a more stable government, while the Bank of England and the stock market encouraged investment in both public debt and private enterprise. The intertwining of war, finance, and commerce produced what historians often call the financial revolution. It turned Britain into a state capable of projecting sustained power across oceans without exhausting its resources. This system also encouraged innovation. New insurance firms like Lloyd's of London underwrote shipping ventures. Joint stock companies multiplied, managing trade with Africa, the Americas, and Asia. The East India Company, revitalized after the turmoil of the 17th century, benefited from military protection and growing capital investment. The same fiscal mechanisms that paid for European wars now financed the expansion of trade in the East Indies. The union with Scotland further strengthened this imperial economy. Scottish ports such as Glasgow became centers for the tobacco trade with North America. Scottish universities trained administrators and engineers who would serve across the empire. The shared British identity that emerged blended Protestant faith, commercial ambition, and a belief in progress, an ideology that justified empire as both civilizing and profitable. Yet the creation of this new imperial state also carried contradictions. The same parliament that championed liberty at home oversaw colonies built on slavery abroad. The wealth that poured into London and Edinburgh came from plantations and trade systems that relied on coercion. The state's efficiency in taxation and debt collection sometimes bred resentment among its own citizens, as excise duties touched daily life. These tensions between freedom and control, morality and profit, would reappear throughout the empire's history. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain had become one of the most powerful maritime states in Europe, but it was still one among several competing empires. France remained its principal rival, wealthy, populous, and possessing vast colonial domains stretching from Canada to the Caribbean and India. Spain still controlled immense territories in the Americas, and other European powers lingered at the edges of global trade. The balance of power that had been shaped by earlier wars was about to collapse, giving rise to the first truly global conflict in history, the 7 Years' War. Between 1756 and 1763, Britain and France fought across 5 continents and on every major ocean. The war would decide not only who ruled North America and India, but also which empire would dominate the modern world. For Britain, it was both a military struggle and a test of the fiscal military system built since the Glorious Revolution. The outcome would transform the empire from a trading network into a global superpower. The roots of the conflict lay in the overlapping ambitions of Britain and France. In North America, British settlers had been pushing westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains into territories claimed by France. The French, meanwhile, sought to connect their colonies in Canada with Louisiana through a chain of forts along the Ohio River Valley. Tensions erupted in 1754 when a young Virginia officer named George Washington led a small force against the French at Fort Duquesne. The skirmish was minor, but it set off a chain reaction that drew both empires into open war. The European phase began 2 years later when Prussia, led by Frederick the Great, invaded Saxony, provoking France, Austria, and Russia to form a coalition against him. Britain, bound by alliance to Prussia, entered the conflict as its chief financial and naval supporter. This alignment allowed Britain to focus its land efforts on funding continental allies, while directing its own forces toward overseas conquest. The war thus unfolded on 2 intertwined fronts: the continental struggle in Europe and the colonial contest across the seas. At the heart of Britain's strategy was William Pitt the Elder, who became Secretary of State in 1757. Pitt believed that Britain's strength lay in its navy and global trade. He famously declared that America was won in Germany, meaning that subsidizing Prussia's land battles allowed Britain to direct its energies elsewhere. Under his leadership, the empire launched a series of coordinated assaults on French possessions around the world. In North America, this campaign became known as the French and Indian War. British forces, bolstered by colonial militias, aimed to drive the French from Canada and secure control of the continent. The early years were marked by failure, disastrous expeditions, and poor coordination. But from 1758 onward, under generals such as Geoffrey Amherst and James Wolfe, the tide turned. The capture of Louisbourg, the key fortress guarding the Gulf of St. Lawrence, opened the way to Quebec. The decisive moment came in 1759 with the Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. In a brief but intense engagement, British forces under Wolfe defeated the French army led by Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Both commanders were killed, but the victory secured British control of Quebec and, soon after, all of Canada. The conquest was more than military triumph. It represented the fall of France's North American empire and the beginning of Britain's dominance in the New World. While armies fought in Canada, the Royal Navy waged a relentless campaign across the oceans. British fleets blockaded French ports, intercepted supply convoys, and captured enemy colonies. The Navy's reach was unprecedented. In the Caribbean, British forces seized Guadeloupe and Martinique, both immensely valuable for their sugar production. These victories demonstrated how naval superiority could translate directly into economic gain. In India, the war took a different form. The East India Company, now a powerful military and political actor, confronted French ambitions through a combination of diplomacy and force. The key figure here was Robert Clive, whose daring leadership at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 transformed the company's fortunes. With a small force of British troops and Indian sepoys, Clive defeated the army of the Nawab of Bengal, aided by local defectors who resented the Nawab's rule. The victory at Plassey had consequences far beyond the battlefield. It allowed the East India Company to install a pliant ruler in Bengal and secure the right to collect revenues from the province. In effect, a private trading company had become a sovereign power. The immense wealth of Bengal, its textiles, crops, and taxes, would fund British expansion across the subcontinent. The foundations of British India were laid not by the crown, but by corporate conquest. The combination of naval dominance and financial stability gave Britain a decisive edge. Its credit system, supported by the Bank of England, allowed it to sustain war spending on an unprecedented scale. The same mechanisms that had financed earlier European conflicts now supported global operations, fleets in the Caribbean, garrisons in North America, and armies in India. France, by contrast, struggled under debt and logistical weakness. By 1760, the results were clear. British troops controlled Canada, the Royal Navy ruled the Atlantic, and French power in India was collapsing. Spain entered the war on France's side in 1761, but its intervention only widened Britain's victories. British forces captured Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines, demonstrating the truly global reach of British arms. Though both cities were returned in the peace settlement, their capture showed that no colonial possession was beyond British attack. The war concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The terms confirmed Britain's transformation into the world's leading imperial power. France ceded Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain surrendered Florida in exchange for Havana. In India, France retained only a few trading posts under strict restrictions. Britain emerged with vast new territories and an empire spanning the globe. The consequences of the 7 Years' War were immense and complex. Britain's territorial gains created new administrative and financial challenges. Governing Canada, the Caribbean islands, and Bengal required an expanded bureaucracy and standing army, both expensive to maintain. The war had doubled the national debt, leading ministers to seek new sources of revenue, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences in the American colonies. For the colonies themselves, the victory was both triumphant and unsettling. The removal of the French threat in North America gave British settlers a sense of security, but also a sense of independence. Many colonists believed they had fought and paid their share during the war and now deserved recognition and autonomy. The British government, on the other hand, expected greater contributions from its colonies to pay for their defense. This conflict of expectations would soon erupt into open dispute. In India, the East India Company's new powers brought enormous profits but also controversy. Reports of corruption, exploitation, and famine in Bengal shocked opinion at home. The company's transformation from merchant enterprise to territorial ruler raised fundamental questions about governance, morality, and responsibility. Though these issues would not be fully addressed for decades, the roots of Britain's later involvement in Indian administration were firmly planted here. The war also had lasting effects on global trade. The destruction of France's overseas empire opened new markets for British goods and secured control over lucrative commodities like sugar, tea, and tobacco. The Royal Navy's dominance ensured that British merchants could trade safely across the world, laying the groundwork for what historians later called Pax Britannica, a century of maritime supremacy and relative peace under British power. But the cost of victory was heavy. The national debt reached unprecedented levels, and the government's attempts to recoup expenses through taxation would ignite the American Revolution. The empire that emerged from the 7 Years' War was stronger and larger than ever before, yet it was also more fragile, bound together by policies that many subjects would soon challenge. The 7 Years' War had transformed Britain into the dominant global power, but its triumphs created problems as vast as its new territories. Victory brought not only land and prestige, but also the responsibility to govern millions of new subjects across the world. Many of them non-European, non-Christian, and unfamiliar with British institutions. In North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and especially India, Britain now faced the challenge of turning conquest into stable administration. The years that followed would reveal how difficult that task could be. In India, the East India Company emerged from the war as a territorial ruler rather than a mere trading organization. Its victory at Plassey had given it control of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in Asia, and the subsequent Treaty of Allahabad in 1765 secured its right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This arrangement, known as the Diwani, effectively made the company the fiscal authority over tens of millions of people. At home, the company's directors in London celebrated the profits pouring in from Bengal's treasury. Dividends soared, and investors spoke of India as a limitless source of wealth. Yet, on the ground, British power rested on fragile foundations. Company officials were few, unfamiliar with Indian governance, and primarily motivated by personal enrichment. They relied heavily on existing Mughal administrative systems, but manipulated them for private gain. The result was corruption on a staggering scale. Local Indian elites, zamindars, bankers, and tax collectors found ways to profit under the new regime. But the burden fell heavily on peasants and artisans. Revenues were extracted with little concern for sustainability, and when harvests failed, the consequences were catastrophic. In 1770, Bengal was struck by a devastating famine that killed perhaps a third of its population. Fields lay barren, villages were abandoned, and the once prosperous province descended into misery. News of this disaster reached Britain at a time when public interest in the empire was growing. Reports of company mismanagement provoked outrage among politicians, writers, and moralists. Critics argued that a private corporation should not wield the powers of a sovereign state. The scandal sparked parliamentary inquiries and fierce debates over how to regulate Britain's faraway empire. The company's most prominent defender and reformer during this period was Warren Hastings, who became governor of Bengal in the early 1770s. Hastings attempted to bring order to the company's chaotic administration. He codified laws, reorganized revenue collection, and sought to work through Indian institutions rather than replace them outright. His efforts represented the first systematic attempt by Britain to govern rather than merely exploit its Indian possessions. At the same time, the company's growing authority forced Britain to reconsider the nature of empire itself. The Crown and Parliament had not designed this expansion. It had happened through private enterprise and military opportunism. Now, however, Britain could no longer ignore the political consequences. The question was whether the state should intervene to restrain the company's power or continue to let commerce drive imperial policy. These debates culminated in the Regulating Act of 1773, Parliament's first serious effort to bring the East India Company under governmental supervision. The act established a governor-general in Bengal with authority over other company presidencies, creating the post that Hastings would fill. It also created a council in Calcutta and mandated periodic reporting to the government in London. Though imperfectly enforced, the act marked a turning point. The British state was now formally involved in governing India. Elsewhere in the empire, similar challenges were unfolding. In North America, Britain's victory over France had eliminated its old rival, but left behind a complex political problem. The vast new territories west of the Appalachian Mountains were inhabited by indigenous nations whose allegiance and autonomy could not easily be dismissed. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation attempted to regulate settlement by forbidding colonists from encroaching on these lands without Crown permission. For many American settlers, however, this policy was an outrage. Having fought and bled during the war, they expected the freedom to expand westward. The proclamation line was seen as a betrayal, a favor to indigenous peoples and royal authority at the expense of colonial rights. At the same time, Britain's enormous war debt prompted new taxation measures in the colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 introduced duties on imported goods and legal documents. The colonial response was explosive. Merchants boycotted British goods, assemblies denounced taxation without representation, and pamphleteers such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson framed the issue as one of liberty. The imperial government insisted that Parliament's authority was supreme, while colonists argued that they possessed the same rights as Englishmen at home. What had begun as a fiscal measure quickly evolved into a constitutional crisis. In the Caribbean, meanwhile, Britain faced the continuing dilemma of how to balance profitability and control in its plantation colonies. Sugar remained the most lucrative commodity in the empire, and its production depended entirely on enslaved labor. The wealth of Jamaica, Barbados, and the smaller islands enriched Britain's merchants and filled its treasury with customs revenue. But constant fear of rebellion kept these societies under tight military rule. Slave uprisings, such as those in Jamaica during the 1760s, revealed the underlying instability of the plantation system. Africa's role in the imperial network also expanded during this period. Though the Royal African Company's monopoly had ended, private traders from Bristol, Liverpool, and London continued to dominate the Atlantic slave trade. The traffic in enslaved Africans grew even larger, supplying labor to the Caribbean and the American South. The profits from this trade financed industrial development in Britain and sustained the mercantile system that linked empire and economy. Back in Britain, the governance of this vast imperial network demanded new institutions and ideas. The Board of Trade, created earlier in the century, now took on greater significance as the coordinating body for colonial affairs. Economists and political thinkers debated how to reconcile imperial unity with local autonomy. The philosopher Adam Smith, in his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, argued that colonies should trade freely rather than be confined within restrictive mercantilist systems. His ideas would profoundly influence later imperial policy, though at the time, they challenged entrenched interests. The imperial bureaucracy also became increasingly professionalized. Civil servants, naval officers, and colonial administrators saw themselves as part of a common enterprise serving the crown. The British state that had emerged after the Glorious Revolution now extended its reach across oceans, binding distant territories through law, finance, and military power. Yet this very efficiency also deepened resentment among colonists who felt increasingly governed from afar. As tensions escalated in America, the empire's contradictions became more visible. Britain claimed to rule by reason and liberty, yet it taxed without representation and maintained slavery at the heart of its wealth. It prided itself on law and order, yet allowed a private company to govern millions in India. These inconsistencies reflected the transitional nature of empire during the 1760s and 70s, a system shifting from mercantile opportunism to bureaucratic authority. By the mid-1770s, the crisis in North America had reached a breaking point. British troops occupied Boston, colonial militias organized resistance, and debates in Parliament grew bitter. Some leaders, like Edmund Burke, warned that force would only alienate loyal subjects. Others insisted that imperial authority must be upheld. When fighting finally broke out in 1775, the empire entered a new and perilous phase. In India, too, British rule was becoming more formalized and intrusive. The East India Company's growing army, composed largely of Indian sepoys commanded by British officers, gave it military supremacy, but its political legitimacy remained fragile. Hastings's reforms brought some stability, yet they also deepened British involvement in Indian politics. Wars with regional powers such as Mysore and the Marathas loomed on the horizon. The company's ambition was shifting from trade to dominion. The same logic that had driven Britain to regulate the company in India and the colonies in America also guided its broader imperial policy. The belief that order, profit, and power must be centralized. Yet this centralization carried costs. In America, it provoked revolution. In India, it created resentment and dependency. Across the empire, Britain was learning that conquest was easier than governance. By the mid-1770s, the British Empire stood at the height of its global reach, yet on the verge of its most serious internal crisis. The triumphs of the 7 Years' War had delivered Britain vast new territories and unrivaled naval power, but they also created financial and political strains that the imperial government could not resolve. The American colonies, once symbols of English enterprise and loyalty, now became the center of a conflict that would end Britain's first empire and redirect its ambitions toward new horizons. The origins of the American War of Independence lay in the tension between imperial authority and colonial autonomy. After the war with France, Britain faced enormous debt and sought ways to recover its costs. Ministers in London reasoned that the colonies, which had benefited from British protection, should contribute to the empire's defense. The logic seemed sound from the imperial perspective, but to many colonists, it was a betrayal of the liberties they believed were their birthright. The introduction of the Stamp Act in 1765, requiring that printed materials carry a taxed seal, provoked widespread resistance. Colonial assemblies declared that taxation without representation violated the principles of English law. Though the act was repealed, the controversy established a pattern of protest and mistrust. New measures followed: the townshend duties on imported goods, the Tea Act, and the stationing of British troops in colonial cities to enforce order. Each step deepened resentment. By 1775, open conflict had erupted. At Lexington and Concord, colonial militias exchanged fire with British regulars, and the rebellion spread rapidly. The Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia, assumed political leadership of the colonies. Under the command of George Washington, the Continental Army formed to challenge Britain's military might. What began as a dispute over taxation soon became a struggle for sovereignty. The British government, led initially by Lord North, underestimated the determination of the colonists. Ministers believed that a show of force would restore loyalty, but they misjudged both the logistical challenges of transatlantic warfare and the political unity of the colonies. Britain's armies were formidable, yet every victory required long supply lines and constant reinforcements. The war stretched the empire's resources thin, forcing it to defend distant holdings while fighting a rebellion across an ocean. In the early years, British forces achieved several tactical successes. They captured New York in 1776 and Philadelphia in 1777, driving the Continental Congress temporarily into retreat. But these victories failed to end the rebellion. The vastness of the American landscape and the decentralized nature of colonial resistance made it impossible to impose lasting control. Guerrilla tactics, local militias, and shifting alliances with indigenous nations frustrated British commanders. The turning point came with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The surrender of a British army under General Burgoyne convinced France that the American cause could succeed. The following year, France formally allied with the revolutionaries, bringing not only troops but also naval power that challenged Britain's supremacy at sea. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon joined the conflict, transforming the rebellion into a global war. The alliance with France shifted the balance dramatically. The Royal Navy, previously dominant, now faced a coalition that stretched its forces across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean. Britain could no longer concentrate its fleets or rely on uncontested sea lanes. Meanwhile, American diplomats in Europe, most famously Benjamin Franklin, secured loans and supplies that sustained the revolutionary effort. As the war dragged on, British strategy faltered. Commanders debated whether to crush resistance through decisive battles or to hold key ports and wait for exhaustion to weaken the enemy. Efforts to recruit loyalists and indigenous allies met with limited success. In the southern colonies, where Britain hoped to rally royalist sentiment, the campaign degenerated into brutal civil conflict. The decisive blow came in 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown. British forces under Lord Cornwallis, trapped on the Virginia coast, found themselves encircled by the Continental Army and French troops under General Rochambeau, while a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocked escape by sea. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The defeat effectively ended Britain's hope of military victory. News of the disaster reached London at a moment of political turmoil. Public opinion had turned against the war, and the government of Lord North fell. In 1782, a new ministry led by Lord Rockingham opened peace negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the United States and established its boundaries from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Britain retained Canada, the Caribbean islands, and its overseas trading posts, but its North American empire was gone. The loss of the 13 colonies was a profound psychological shock. For generations, Britons had viewed America as the cornerstone of their imperial destiny, a land of settlement, commerce, and cultural expansion. Its secession raised questions about the very nature of empire and national identity. Many observers feared that Britain's global influence would collapse, yet in time, the defeat prompted adaptation rather than decline. The first step was introspection. Politicians and intellectuals examined the causes of failure. Some blamed ministerial incompetence, others the corruption of Parliament or the arrogance of imperial officials. Figures such as Edmund Burke argued that the empire must be governed by consent rather than coercion. The idea of a free empire, bound by trade and shared principles rather than force, began to take shape, a concept that would influence Britain's later approach to its self-governing colonies. While Britain mourned the loss of America, it also looked elsewhere. Even before the war's end, attention had begun shifting toward Asia and the Pacific. The East India Company remained a source of immense wealth, though also of controversy. Reports of misrule in Bengal and corruption among company officials reached Parliament, leading to renewed debates about imperial oversight. At the same time, new explorations opened vistas far from the Atlantic world that had defined earlier centuries. The voyages of Captain James Cook between 1768 and 1779 symbolized this new direction. Sailing through the Pacific, Cook charted New Zealand, the eastern coast of Australia, and numerous islands previously unknown to Europeans. His expeditions combined scientific inquiry with imperial reconnaissance. The mapping of these regions laid the groundwork for future colonization, particularly in Australia. In the years following the American Revolution, Britain faced a practical problem as well as a strategic one: what to do with convicts now that the American colonies could no longer serve as destinations for transportation. The answer came in the form of a new settlement at Botany Bay on the coast of New South Wales. The first fleet sailed in 1787, carrying hundreds of convicts, soldiers, and officials to establish a penal colony at the edge of the known world. This venture marked the beginning of a new phase in British imperial expansion, one that looked south and east rather than west. The colonization of Australia would grow slowly at first, but it symbolized the empire's resilience and adaptability. Even as Britain lost one empire in America, it was unconsciously laying the foundations for another in the Pacific and Asia. The Caribbean colonies, spared from rebellion, remained central to Britain's economy. Sugar, rum, and coffee continued to flow into London and Bristol, their profits sustaining merchants and investors. Yet, these islands, dependent on enslaved labor, also represented the moral contradictions of the empire. Abolitionist sentiment began to stir at home, especially among religious groups who condemned the cruelty of the slave trade. Though abolition was still decades away, the intellectual and moral debate had begun. Britain's military and naval power, though tested, survived the American defeat intact. The Royal Navy learned valuable lessons about logistics, strategy, and global coordination. The financial institutions established during the previous century allowed the government to recover more quickly than its rivals. France, though victorious in aiding America, emerged from the war bankrupt and unstable, conditions that would soon lead to its own revolution. In the longer view, the loss of America forced Britain to redefine what empire meant. The old model of settler colonies governed like extensions of the homeland had failed. What emerged instead was a more diverse and flexible system: commercial dominance in India, trade monopolies in Asia, and new penal and settler colonies in the Pacific. The empire became less about territorial continuity and more about maritime connectivity, an archipelago of ports, routes, and markets linked by the Royal Navy. The psychological impact of losing the American colonies lingered for years. Many Britons viewed it as a national humiliation, yet others saw it as liberation from a costly and rebellious dependency. The empire's focus now turned toward consolidation, reform, and expansion in regions where British control could be exercised with greater authority and fewer settlers. India, the Caribbean, and the Pacific would become the testing grounds for this new imperial vision. The loss of the American colonies forced Britain to look outward once more, not in defeat, but in reinvention. As the Atlantic world slipped from its control, the empire turned its gaze across the southern oceans toward the vast and scarcely mapped Pacific. There, in the late 18th century, Britain began to construct an entirely new chapter of expansion, one founded not on rebellion and settlement as in America, but on exile, exploration, and maritime ambition. The founding of the colony at Botany Bay in 1788 was both a practical solution and a strategic experiment. For decades, Britain had used its American colonies as destinations for convicts, transporting thousands each year to serve sentences as laborers. With independence, that outlet had vanished and the prisons at home overflowed. The government sought an alternative that would remove the burden from domestic society while simultaneously extending imperial presence into unclaimed lands. Captain Arthur Phillip was chosen to lead the first fleet, 11 ships carrying over 1,000 passengers, including convicts, marines, and officials. The voyage was arduous, lasting more than 8 months and crossing 2 oceans. When the fleet finally anchored in January of 1788, Philip found that Botany Bay, named by Captain James Cook 2 decades earlier, was unsuitable for settlement. The soil was poor and the water scarce. He moved the expedition northward to a sheltered cove that he named Sydney Cove, founding the settlement that would become the city of Sydney. Life in the early colony was harsh. The settlers faced food shortages, isolation, and unfamiliar conditions. Supply ships were infrequent, and the first harvests failed. Discipline was strict, and relations between the colonists and the indigenous Eora people were tense and often violent. Philip, though cautious and pragmatic, could not prevent misunderstandings from escalating into conflict. Indigenous societies, which had thrived on the continent for tens of thousands of years, were suddenly confronted by a foreign power claiming their lands. Disease, displacement, and violence followed, beginning a tragic pattern that would accompany much of Britain's later expansion. Despite these hardships, the colony endured. Within a few years, convicts were building roads, homes, and farms, transforming Sydney from a precarious outpost into a functioning settlement. The introduction of sheep and cattle, brought from South Africa and later from Britain, gave the colony a stable food source and, eventually, a profitable export in wool. What had begun as a penal experiment gradually evolved into a self-sustaining society. The strategic importance of the new colony quickly became apparent to the British government. Situated between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, New South Wales provided a vital naval and commercial foothold in the Southern Hemisphere. The Pacific was increasingly viewed as the future arena of global trade, a vast expanse linking Asia, the Americas, and Europe. The settlement also preempted French ambitions in the region. France had sent its own exploratory missions under Jean-François de la Pérouse, who arrived at Botany Bay only days after Philip. His disappearance on a later voyage added an air of mystery to the race for Pacific exploration. The following decades saw further expeditions to chart the coasts and resources of the region. Naval officers such as Matthew Flinders and George Bass mapped the Australian coastline, confirming that it was indeed a continent rather than a series of islands. Their discoveries opened new routes for navigation and trade. The continent's vast interior, however, remained largely unknown, a challenge that would occupy explorers well into the 19th century. Beyond Australia, Britain's Pacific ambitions extended to other islands. The Pitcairn Islands, Fiji, and Tahiti became intermittent points of contact, though not yet full colonies. Missionaries from the London Missionary Society began to establish themselves in Polynesia, introducing Christianity and Western education while also serving as informal agents of British influence. The blending of religious zeal and imperial ambition became a hallmark of Britain's 19th century expansion. Meanwhile, to the west, the British presence in India deepened. The East India Company's growing military and administrative role made the Indian Ocean central to British strategy. The establishment of a colony in Australia complemented this system by offering a southern naval base to protect trade routes between India, China, and the Pacific. Thus, from its earliest years, the Australian settlement was conceived not as an isolated penal colony, but as part of a broader imperial network. Within the colony itself, society began to change. As the initial convict population served out its sentences, many were granted land and became free settlers. Others chose to remain, bringing families and building communities. By the early 19th century, a class of prosperous landowners, known as the emancipists, had emerged, often in tension with the free settlers who arrived later and looked down on their origins. Governance evolved alongside these social divisions. The appointment of Governor Lachlan Macquarie in 1810 marked a decisive shift from mere survival to development. Macquarie's administration emphasized infrastructure, discipline, and civic pride. He commissioned roads, public buildings, and new towns, many of which still bear his name. Determined to create a respectable society, he encouraged education, commerce, and agriculture, while also advocating for the rights of emancipated convicts. His vision of Australia as a reformed, orderly community clashed with conservative elements in London, who saw the colony primarily as a place of punishment. Nonetheless, Macquarie's policies laid the foundations for a more complex and self-confident colonial society. While New South Wales grew, other settlements followed. Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania, was established as a separate penal colony in the early 19th century, and Norfolk Island was used intermittently for the most hardened offenders. These distant outposts were linked by convict transportation, which became one of the defining features of British imperial logistics. Tens of thousands of men and women were shipped from Britain and Ireland across the world, their forced labor helping to build roads, farms, and public works that anchored imperial control. In time, the penal system itself became a subject of debate. Critics in Britain questioned the morality and effectiveness of transportation. Reformers, such as Elizabeth Fry and Jeremy Bentham, argued for more humane treatment of prisoners and for rehabilitation rather than exile. Their campaigns reflected a broader shift in British society toward moral self-examination, a trend that would also influence debates over slavery and labor in the coming decades. Beyond penal policy, the early 19th century saw the beginnings of Australia's transformation into a commercial colony. Wool, timber, and whaling products became vital exports. British merchants established trading links with China and the Pacific Islands, and ships from Sydney began to circle the world. The colony's isolation, once a curse, now positioned it as a bridge between Asia and the southern oceans. Relations with indigenous peoples, however, deteriorated as settlement expanded inland. Frontier violence intensified, and entire communities were displaced or destroyed. Colonial authorities oscillated between attempts at conciliation and brutal suppression. The dispossession of Aboriginal Australians became one of the darkest legacies of British colonization, a process justified at the time through a doctrine of terra nullius, the false claim that the land had belonged to no one before British arrival. In the broader Pacific, Britain's interests multiplied. Whaling stations were established in New Zealand and along the Antarctic waters, bringing British ships into contact with Maori communities. Traders and missionaries followed, paving the way for eventual colonization later in the century. The Pacific was no longer a blank space on the map, but an emerging sphere of competition among European powers, with Britain increasingly at the forefront. The colonization of Australia also reshaped Britain's global imagination. Artists, writers, and scientists depicted it as both strange and promising. A land of exotic creatures, vast landscapes, and untapped potential. Reports of kangaroos, eucalyptus forests, and coral reefs fascinated the European public. For many, Australia represented the possibility of renewal, a place where British order could be rebuilt after the loss of America, and where social reform could take tangible form. By the 1820s, the colony at Sydney had evolved from penal settlement to burgeoning society. Free migration began to supplement convict labor, bringing skilled artisans, farmers, and entrepreneurs. Towns expanded, trade increased, and the population diversified. The beginnings of a colonial identity, distinct yet loyal to Britain, took shape. Governors now faced new challenges, balancing authority with local demands for representation, managing tensions between free and emancipated settlers, and navigating relations with indigenous peoples whose land continued to be seized. In London, the success of Australia encouraged further imperial exploration. Expeditions to Africa, the Pacific, and the Arctic all reflected Britain's growing confidence as a scientific and naval power. The Royal Navy's charting of coasts and islands not only advanced geography but also extended imperial influence without the need for immediate colonization. The empire was learning to combine knowledge, trade, and power in new ways. The establishment of Australia marked a significant reorientation of Britain's global strategy. The empire that had once faced west across the Atlantic now looked east and south toward Asia and the Pacific. Its heart of gravity was shifting toward the Indian Ocean, where trade with India, China, and the Spice Islands promised wealth far beyond what America had provided. The penal colony at Sydney, seemingly modest in origin, was part of this vast geopolitical recalibration. As the 19th century opened, the British Empire stood at a crossroads. It was a global system that spanned continents and oceans, bound together by commerce, industry, and the power of the Royal Navy. Yet beneath its prosperity lay the dark foundation of slavery and coerced labor. For more than 2 centuries, the empire had depended upon the Atlantic slave trade and the plantation economies of the Caribbean. Now, in the first decades of the new century, a powerful moral movement rose to challenge that foundation, transforming both Britain's conscience and the direction of its imperial project. The abolition movement did not appear suddenly. Its roots stretched back to the late 18th century, nourished by changing religious, philosophical, and social attitudes. The evangelical revival within the Church of England and the rise of dissenting Protestant groups had fostered an emphasis on personal morality and humanitarian concern. Philosophers of the Enlightenment questioned the legitimacy of slavery in a world that claimed to value liberty and reason. Writers, poets, and reformers began to expose the brutal realities of the slave trade. One of the earliest and most influential voices was that of Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African who published his autobiography in 1789. His vivid account of capture, suffering, and eventual freedom gave a human face to the horrors of the trade. At the same time, activists like Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce organized petitions, lectures, and pamphlets to sway public opinion. Their efforts built a movement that united religious conviction with political strategy. By the turn of the century, abolition had become a cause that crossed class boundaries. Middle-class reformers, Quakers, and working men all lent their support. Public meetings drew thousands, and petitions bearing hundreds of thousands of signatures flooded Parliament. The movement's success reflected not only moral outrage, but also Britain's shifting economic interests. The rise of industrial capitalism reduced the direct importance of slave-based sugar to the national economy, while new markets in Asia offered alternative sources of profit. The turning point came with the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, passed in 1807. After years of parliamentary debate and repeated defeats, Wilberforce and his allies finally triumphed. The act made it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved Africans, and any participation in the trade was now punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. Britain, once the largest slave-trading nation in the world, now cast itself as the moral leader in ending the traffic. Yet the abolition of the trade did not immediately end slavery itself. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people still labored in Britain's Caribbean colonies, producing sugar, coffee, and cotton. The planters who owned these estates were powerful and politically connected. They argued that sudden emancipation would destroy the economy and lead to chaos. For the next 3 decades, the struggle shifted from ending the trade to ending the institution of slavery altogether. Meanwhile, Britain began to enforce its new moral stance through naval power. The West Africa Squadron, established in 1808, patrolled the Atlantic to suppress the slave trade. British ships intercepted slavers of all nations, freeing thousands of captives and resettling many in Sierra Leone, a colony founded earlier as a haven for freed Africans. The squadron's operations were dangerous and costly. Disease and conflict claimed many sailors' lives. Yet the effort became a symbol of Britain's new self-image as a global force for moral reform. The campaign against slavery gained further momentum in the 1820s. Industrial and religious reformers alike saw it as part of a broader effort to purify society. The same moral fervor that inspired movements for prison reform, education, and temperance also fueled abolitionism. The Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, founded in 1823, coordinated petitions and debates throughout the empire. Public pressure increased after the Demerara Rebellion of 1823 in what is now Guyana, when enslaved laborers rose against brutal plantation conditions. The rebellion was crushed, but news of it shocked British audiences. Missionaries who had supported the enslaved were accused of inciting revolt, and their trials became causes célèbres among abolitionists. The event revealed the growing moral contradiction between Britain's professed values and the realities of its empire. At the same time, political change at home made reform more likely. The Reform Act of 1832, which expanded representation in Parliament, weakened the grip of the West Indian planter class. New members, influenced by public opinion and evangelical conviction, were more receptive to abolitionist arguments. Industrial cities such as Manchester and Birmingham, whose workers boycotted sugar made by enslaved labor, added economic weight to moral principle. In 1833, after years of petitions, debates, and demonstrations, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. The legislation declared that slavery would be abolished in nearly all British colonies, freeing around 800,000 men, women, and children. It also provided a massive compensation package, not to the freed, but to the slave owners, who received £20 million for the loss of their property. Enslaved people were instead subjected to a transitional system known as apprenticeship, requiring them to work for their former masters for several years before gaining full freedom. The apprenticeship system ended earlier than expected in 1838 due to persistent protests and the work of abolitionists who exposed its abuses. True emancipation had finally arrived. Across the Caribbean, Africa, and the Indian Ocean colonies, ceremonies marked the moment when the enslaved became free subjects of the crown. The empire had taken a decisive moral turn, at least in its rhetoric. The abolition of slavery reshaped Britain's global role. It gave the empire a new sense of mission, presenting its expansion as a civilizing and humanitarian enterprise. Politicians and missionaries alike argued that British rule would bring progress, Christianity, and commerce to the world's less developed regions. This self-image would justify imperial intervention throughout the 19th century, even as it masked ongoing economic and racial inequalities. The moral transformation also had economic consequences. Freed laborers sought land, independence, and fair wages, while planters scrambled to maintain production. Many estates collapsed or turned to indentured laborers from India and China, inaugurating new systems of migration and exploitation. The shift from slavery to wage labor reshaped the Caribbean economy and connected it more closely to global industrial markets. The empire's new humanitarian mission extended beyond abolition. British explorers and missionaries pushed deeper into Africa, describing their journeys as efforts to end the slave trade at its source. Men such as David Livingstone would later carry this vision into the heart of the continent, blending moral conviction with imperial ambition. The suppression of the slave trade thus became both a genuine ethical crusade and a convenient justification for territorial expansion. Within Britain, the success of abolition reinforced national pride. The public celebrated it as proof of moral superiority and divine favor. Songs, sermons, and schoolbooks proclaimed Britain the champion of freedom, even as its factories consumed raw materials produced by forced or underpaid labor elsewhere. The contradiction between ideals and reality persisted, but the rhetoric of humanitarian empire had taken root. The abolitionist movement also left a lasting political legacy. It demonstrated the power of organized public opinion in shaping imperial policy. The use of petitions, boycotts, and moral persuasion became models for later campaigns. including those for labor rights, women's suffrage, and social reform. The notion that empire could serve a moral purpose, an idea born in the age of abolition, would endure well into the 20th century. Yet, emancipation did not bring equality. Formerly enslaved people across the Caribbean continued to face poverty, racial discrimination, and limited access to political power. Colonial authorities introduced new labor laws to compel work on plantations, and economic dependence persisted. True freedom remained constrained by structural inequality, revealing that abolition was only the beginning of a longer struggle. In the Indian Ocean world, Britain's anti-slavery patrols extended to East Africa and the Persian Gulf, challenging Arab and Portuguese traders. These missions strengthened Britain's influence along the African coast and in the Middle East, preparing the ground for future colonial involvement. The same navy that once protected commerce now policed morality, enforcing a global order under the Union Jack. As the 19th century dawned, the British Empire faced a new and formidable challenge that would test its endurance, its economy, and its global reach. The outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1793, followed by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, plunged Europe and much of the world into more than 2 decades of near-constant conflict. For Britain, these wars were not only a fight for national survival, but also the crucible in which its modern empire was forged. Out of war emerged a new order, an age of maritime dominance and global trade that later generations would call Pax Britannica, the British peace. The roots of this era lay in the upheavals of the French Revolution, when revolutionaries executed Louis XVI and declared war on the monarchies of Europe. Britain initially hesitated to intervene. But the spread of revolutionary ideas, combined with France's aggression in the Low Countries, forced the government of William Pitt the Younger to act. In February of 1793, Britain declared war on France, beginning a struggle that would last, with brief interruptions, until the spring of 1815. The conflict quickly became global. France sought to challenge Britain's naval and colonial supremacy, while Britain used its maritime power to blockade French ports, protect its trade, and seize enemy colonies. This contest for the seas would define the age. The Royal Navy, already the strongest in Europe, expanded rapidly, becoming the backbone of Britain's defense and its imperial expansion. Early in the wars, Britain suffered reverses on land. Revolutionary armies swept across Europe, toppling monarchies and redrawing borders. Yet at sea, British power proved unmatched. The decisive moment came in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar, where Admiral Horatio Nelson defeated a combined French and Spanish fleet off the coast of Spain. Though Nelson was killed in the battle, his victory destroyed Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain and ensured British control of the world's oceans for the next century. With naval supremacy secured, Britain turned its attention to the wider world. The wars provided opportunities for conquest and consolidation across the globe. In the Caribbean, British forces captured French colonies such as St. Lucia and Trinidad. In the Indian Ocean, they seized strategic islands including the Cape of Good Hope and Ceylon, both vital for controlling trade routes to India and Asia. These acquisitions strengthened Britain's maritime empire and connected its possessions more tightly than ever before. India remained at the heart of Britain's eastern strategy. The East India Company, still the formal ruler of large parts of the subcontinent, used the turmoil of the Napoleonic period to expand its influence. The wars against the Maratha Confederacy and the Kingdom of Mysore brought vast territories under company control. By the early 1800s, the Mughal emperor was little more than a figurehead, and the company's armies, commanded by British officers but composed mainly of Indian soldiers, dominated the subcontinent. This territorial consolidation was not merely military. The company began to develop systems of governance that would later form the basis of colonial administration. Taxation, legal codes, and land reforms were standardized, while missionary and educational efforts sought to reshape Indian society along British lines. Though these policies were often framed as enlightened reform, they also deepened British control and disrupted traditional economies. At home, the Napoleonic Wars transformed Britain's economy and politics. The demands of total war required unprecedented mobilization of resources. The government raised taxes, borrowed heavily, and expanded industry to produce ships, weapons, and supplies. The Industrial Revolution, already underway, accelerated as factories and technological innovations met the needs of war. The same coal and iron that fueled industrial growth also powered the empire's war machine. The strain of war reshaped British society. Food shortages, high prices, and labor unrest led to protests and occasional riots. Yet the unity of purpose fostered by the conflict helped forge a sense of national identity centered on liberty, maritime power, and resistance to tyranny. The image of Britain as the defender of civilization against French despotism became a powerful national myth that endured long after the wars ended. In diplomacy, Britain pursued a strategy of financing continental allies while focusing its own efforts on naval warfare. This blue water strategy, as it later became known, allowed Britain to sustain multiple coalitions against France without overcommitting its army in Europe. Subsidies to Prussia, Austria, and Russia kept the continental struggle alive, while British forces struck at French colonies and trade routes. The empire became both a source of wealth and a weapon of war. Napoleon's continental system, intended to exclude British goods from European markets, only reinforced Britain's maritime orientation. Unable to trade freely with the continent, British merchants expanded their reach across the globe. New markets opened in Latin America, the Mediterranean, and Asia. The war thus spurred globalization, driving British commerce into every accessible port. By 1812, the tide had turned decisively against Napoleon. His disastrous invasion of Russia weakened his empire, and Britain's alliances tightened around him. On the Iberian Peninsula, British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, led a successful campaign to liberate Spain and Portugal. Years of grueling warfare culminated in the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, where Wellington, with Prussian support, finally defeated Napoleon. The victory ended more than 20 years of conflict and ushered in a new era of European stability dominated by Britain. The wars left Britain exhausted but triumphant. Its navy ruled the seas, its trade networks spanned the world, and its financial system had proved resilient. The Bank of England's ability to manage credit and debt during wartime confirmed London's role as the emerging center of global finance. The empire that emerged from the Napoleonic struggle was stronger, wealthier, and more self-assured than ever before. The Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map of Europe in 1815, also confirmed Britain's strategic priorities. Unlike continental powers that sought territorial gains in Europe, Britain focused on securing naval bases and colonies that ensured command of global trade routes. The Cape of Good Hope, Malta, and Ceylon became permanent possessions, forming a chain of stations that linked Britain to India and beyond. This global network made Britain the guardian of the world's sea lanes, a role that would define the next century. The defeat of France also reshaped Britain's imperial ideology. The wars had been framed as a defense of liberty against tyranny, and this moral narrative now extended to empire itself. British leaders began to portray their global dominance as a force for order and progress, a Pax Britannica that would keep peace through naval supremacy and free trade. The same fleet that had once blockaded France now patrolled the oceans, protecting commerce and suppressing the slave trade. This new world order rested on three pillars: industrial might, naval power, and financial stability. The Industrial Revolution enabled mass production and technological innovation. The Navy ensured that British goods reached every market, and the financial institutions created during the 18th century provided the credit that kept trade flowing. Together, these forces turned Britain into the hub of a global economy. The post-war decades also saw the beginnings of a cultural and intellectual shift in how empire was understood. Writers, artists, and politicians celebrated Britain's role as the world's civilizing power. The expansion of missionary societies and humanitarian organizations linked moral purpose to imperial ambition. The abolition of the slave trade gave Britain a sense of moral leadership that justified further intervention abroad. At the same time, the empire faced new challenges: Demobilization brought economic hardship, and unrest among workers and the poor revealed the inequalities of industrial society. In Ireland, political discontent simmered under harsh conditions. Yet despite these internal tensions, Britain's global position remained unchallenged. Its navy outmatched all rivals combined, and its economy was the engine of world trade. The Napoleonic Wars thus marked both an end and a beginning. They ended the long struggle for European supremacy that had dominated the previous century, and began a century in which Britain would shape global affairs through commerce rather than conquest. The era of constant warfare gave way to an age of relative peace, maintained not by armies on the continent, but by ships on the seas. The decades following the Napoleonic Wars marked a profound transformation in how Britain conceived, organized, and justified its empire. The enormous military conflicts of the previous century had left the country with unrivaled naval dominance and a flourishing industrial base. Yet, rather than pursuing expansion through conquest, Britain turned increasingly toward commerce, shaping an imperial order grounded in markets, finance, and economic ideology. This new phase, often described as the Free Trade Empire, extended British influence across the globe not merely by force of arms, but by the power of trade and capital. The concept of free trade rested on the belief that open markets and the free flow of goods would create prosperity for all nations. In practice, however, it often meant that Britain, as the world's leading industrial power, could flood global markets with its manufactured goods while drawing in raw materials at favorable prices. This ideology was supported by a combination of moral conviction and material interest. Economists such as Adam Smith, whose ideas gained new prominence in these years, argued that commerce would replace conquest as the true path to civilization and peace. Politicians and industrialists embraced the notion as both practical and virtuous, turning economic dominance into a form of moral authority. The pivot toward free trade coincided with major domestic reforms. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 symbolized a national commitment to open markets. These laws had long protected British landowners by imposing tariffs on imported grain, but their repeal marked the triumph of industrial over agricultural interests. The new economic orthodoxy celebrated competition and global exchange, reinforcing the empire's outward orientation. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in India, which had by this time become the cornerstone of Britain's imperial economy. The East India Company, though still nominally a trading corporation, had evolved into a governing authority controlling vast territories. After the Charter Act of 1833, the company lost its commercial monopoly and became effectively a political administration under the oversight of Parliament. India was no longer a realm of merchants, but of bureaucrats, soldiers, and financiers serving the imperial state. The company's rule in India rested on fiscal extraction. Land revenue provided the bulk of its income, collected through systems such as the permanent settlement in Bengal and the Rayotwari and Mahalwari arrangements elsewhere. These systems imposed fixed or variable taxes on cultivators, often enforced through intermediaries who profited from peasant labor. The result was a steady flow of wealth from India to Britain, financing the colonial administration, the British Army in Asia, and even the payment of dividends to shareholders in London. India became, in effect, the fiscal engine of the British Empire. Indian revenues also sustained Britain's growing military presence across Asia. Regiments of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, were deployed not only within the subcontinent, but also in Burma, Afghanistan, and China. This arrangement allowed Britain to project power far beyond what its population at home could support. The Indian treasury paid for expeditions, while Indian troops enforced Britain's global ambitions. The empire was being managed as an interconnected economic system, where finance and force reinforced one another. At the same time, Britain's global commerce expanded eastward toward China, whose immense population and markets attracted traders eager to exchange British goods for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The problem was that China's Qing Empire demanded payment in silver, creating a severe trade imbalance. British merchants sought a solution in a product grown under their control in India: opium. The opium trade began modestly in the late 18th century but grew rapidly under the East India Company's supervision. The company did not sell opium directly to China, where the drug was illegal, but it auctioned opium to private merchants in India who smuggled it into Chinese ports. By the 1830s, the opium trade had become one of the most profitable enterprises in the empire, reversing the flow of silver and enriching British and Indian merchants alike. The human cost, however, was immense. Addiction spread widely among Chinese consumers, undermining social stability and provoking fierce opposition from Chinese officials. When the Qing government confiscated opium stocks and expelled British traders in 1839, Britain responded with military force, launching what became known as the First Opium War. The conflict was brief but decisive. British steamships, armed with modern cannons, easily outmatched the Qing Navy and coastal defenses. The resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842 marked the beginning of China's so-called Century of Humiliation. It forced China to open 5 ports to British trade, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and grant most favored nation status to British merchants. The treaty system that followed effectively subordinated Chinese sovereignty to Western economic interests. For Britain, victory in the Opium War was more than a military success. It was a demonstration of the power of commerce backed by technology. The war showed that industrial production, maritime transport, and steam power could achieve what armies alone could not. Gunboat diplomacy became the instrument of free trade, enforcing the rules of global commerce in the name of civilization. The consequences extended far beyond China. The treaties opened Asia to a wave of missionary, diplomatic, and commercial activity. British firms established trading houses in Shanghai and Canton, while the Royal Navy maintained a permanent presence in East Asian waters. The control of Hong Kong provided a secure base for regional trade and became one of the empire's most important entrepôts. Back in India, the fiscal and military pressures of maintaining this global system deepened. Company officials sought to increase revenue through new land taxes and administrative reforms. They also promoted cash crops such as indigo, cotton, and opium, tying Indian agriculture ever more closely to the demands of global markets. The effects on local economies were mixed. While some regions prospered, others suffered from overproduction, environmental degradation, and famine. British administrators viewed India primarily as a source of revenue and raw materials rather than as a community of subjects with political rights. The ideology of free trade also reshaped imperial governance. The Charter Act of 1833 had proclaimed that India should be administered for the benefit of all its inhabitants, but in practice, economic liberalism often served as a justification for British control. Officials argued that colonial rule brought progress, rationality, and the rule of law to societies deemed stagnant. The spread of English education, legal codes, and infrastructure projects such as railways and canals were all presented as instruments of improvement, though they also facilitated economic extraction and military mobility. The 1840s and 50s were years of both triumph and tension for this commercial empire. The Second Opium War later in the decade, fought alongside France, extended Britain's privileges in China and legalized the opium trade. Meanwhile, new markets opened in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where British merchants and missionaries followed the expanding routes of steamship and telegraph. Technological innovation underpinned this expansion. The invention of the steam engine revolutionized transport, reducing travel times and making communication across the empire faster and more reliable. Railways in India connected inland regions to ports, facilitating the export of cotton, tea, and opium. Steamships shortened the journey between Britain and its colonies, while the laying of telegraph cables in the 1850s began to bind the empire together in real time. The intellectual climate of the age reinforced these material changes. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who worked for the East India Company, articulated a vision of empire grounded in utilitarian philosophy. Mill and others argued that British rule was a means of advancing civilization through education, infrastructure, and economic development. This belief in the empire's moral mission blended seamlessly with the pursuit of profit, creating a self-justifying ideology that would dominate British policy for decades. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity and progress, the contradictions of the free trade empire were mounting. The reliance on Indian revenues placed immense strain on local populations. The exploitation of opium in China exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that preached morality while profiting from addiction. And the spread of railways and education in India created a new class of Western-educated elites who would one day challenge British authority. By the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire in India appeared to be at the height of its power. The East India Company governed territories stretching from the Himalayas to Cape Comorin, commanding one of the largest standing armies in the world. British officials oversaw taxation, law, and trade across a subcontinent of more than 150 million people. Railways, telegraphs, and canals symbolized progress. English schools and courts projected authority. Yet beneath this facade of order lay deep unease. The wealth of empire had been built on systems of control that disrupted traditional societies, drained local economies, and eroded trust between rulers and ruled. In 1857, that tension exploded into the most serious rebellion Britain had yet faced. An uprising that would end the East India Company's rule and usher in direct governance by the British Crown. The causes of the 1857 uprising, often called the Indian Rebellion or the Sepoy Mutiny, were complex and cumulative. At its heart lay a crisis of legitimacy. For more than a century, the East India Company had expanded through conquest and annexation, claiming to bring order and reform while undermining local elites. The doctrine of lapse, introduced by Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, allowed the company to seize any princely state whose ruler died without a direct male heir. This policy alienated many Indian princes who had once been allies. Prominent among the dispossessed was Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, whose resistance would later become legendary. Economic grievances compounded political resentment. Land reforms, particularly in northern India, disrupted traditional patterns of ownership. Heavy taxation forced peasants into debt, while the shift to cash crops left many vulnerable to famine. British industrial goods, imported under free trade policies, destroyed local textile industries that had flourished for centuries. Craftsmen and merchants faced ruin, their livelihoods displaced by British factories thousands of miles away. Religious and cultural anxieties deepened the unrest. British missionaries, encouraged by the empire's new moral mission, sought to convert Indians to Christianity. Their presence, though limited, fed fears that the British intended to undermine Hindu and Muslim faiths. The introduction of new technologies, railways, telegraphs, and even uniform clothing, symbolized foreign intrusion into everyday life. Among both elites and commoners, suspicion grew that British rule threatened not only material prosperity, but also social and spiritual order. The immediate spark came from within the company's own army. The sepoys, Indian soldiers who formed the backbone of British power, had long been both loyal and indispensable. Yet they faced increasing grievances, low pay, unequal treatment, and loss of status compared with British officers. In early 1857, rumors spread that the new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. To load the weapon, soldiers had to bite the cartridge, an act that seemed to force them into violating their religious taboos. When sepoys at Meerut, near Delhi, refused to use the cartridges, they were punished harshly. On May 10th, their comrades mutinied, killing British officers and marching to Delhi. There, they proclaimed the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II as the symbolic leader of a revived Indian sovereignty. The rebellion spread rapidly across northern and central India, uniting soldiers, peasants, and discontented princes in a wave of revolt. The uprising's early phase was chaotic but powerful. In cities such as Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow, British authority collapsed. Rebels captured garrisons, destroyed telegraph lines, and declared independence. Some uprisings were spontaneous and locally driven. Others were coordinated by leaders seeking to restore regional kingdoms. In Kanpur, Nana Sahib, the adopted son of a deposed Maratha ruler, took command and sought to expel the British entirely. In Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai led her troops with extraordinary courage, becoming a symbol of resistance for generations to come. For the British, the shock was profound. The empire that had prided itself on stability and progress suddenly faced a revolt that threatened its very existence. News of massacres, real and exaggerated, spread across Britain, igniting anger and calls for retribution. The colonial administration, caught unprepared, appealed for reinforcements from across the empire. Troops arrived from Britain, as well as from loyal regiments in Punjab and from colonial garrisons as far away as Burma and the Persian Gulf. The British counteroffensive was ruthless. Under generals such as Colin Campbell and Henry Havelock, Imperial forces reconquered rebel-held territories in a series of bloody sieges. Delhi fell in September 1857 after weeks of fierce fighting. The Mughal emperor was captured and his sons were executed, an act that symbolically ended the Mughal dynasty. Kanpur and Lucknow were retaken after brutal battles marked by atrocities on both sides. By mid-1858, the rebellion had been crushed, though sporadic resistance continued for months. The cost in human life was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Indians perished, rebels, civilians, and loyalists alike, while British casualties, though smaller, were seared into imperial memory. The violence left deep scars on both conqueror and conquered. For Indians, it was a moment of collective trauma and defiance. For Britons, it confirmed a hardened sense of racial and cultural superiority. The British press depicted the uprising as a barbaric betrayal by people unfit for self-government, justifying future repression in the name of order and civilization. The consequences of the rebellion were transformative. The British government concluded that the East India Company could no longer be trusted with the governance of an entire subcontinent. In 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, formally dissolving the company and transferring all its territories, armies, and responsibilities to the British Crown. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising religious tolerance, protection of property, and equal treatment under the law. This marked the beginning of the British Raj, the era of direct imperial rule that would last until the mid-20th century. The administrative structure of India was overhauled. The position of Viceroy of India was created to represent the monarch, supported by the Indian Civil Service, a small but powerful cadre of officials recruited through competitive examination. The army was reorganized to prevent future mutinies. The proportion of British soldiers was increased, and Indian regiments were divided by region, religion, and caste to minimize unity. The railways and telegraphs, once symbols of modernity, were now used as instruments of surveillance and control. The rebellion also reshaped British attitudes toward empire. Before 1857, many British officials had spoken of reforming India and integrating its elites into a modern, rational order. Afterward, the prevailing sentiment shifted toward paternalism and racial hierarchy. The empire's mission was now framed less as partnership and more as guardianship. Britain would rule for India, but not with Indians. This attitude permeated colonial education, law, and administration for decades. At the same time, Indian society was undergoing subtle but significant changes. The experience of rebellion and repression fostered new forms of political consciousness. Western-educated Indians, products of the very schools established by British reformers, began to debate the future of their country. They studied liberal and nationalist ideas circulating in Europe and wondered whether Britain's own values of freedom and representation might one day apply to India. Seeds of a nascent Indian nationalism were quietly taking root, though it would take another generation for them to bloom. The rebellion also left an indelible mark on British culture. In literature, art, and public memory, it was portrayed as both tragedy and triumph. Paintings and novels dramatized heroic sieges and the supposed treachery of rebels. Monuments were erected to fallen soldiers, while the Indian participants were largely silenced in official accounts. The event became a moral parable of empire, a lesson in the dangers of leniency and the necessity of firm rule. Economically, the transfer of power from company to crown brought centralization and investment. Railways expanded rapidly, linking major cities and facilitating troop movements and commerce alike. Irrigation projects and telegraph lines multiplied. India became even more integrated into the global economy, exporting raw materials and importing British manufactured goods. Yet, beneath the rhetoric of progress, the pattern of extraction continued, the colony enriching the metropole at great cost to its people. The birth of the Raj marked a new phase of imperial governance, combining bureaucratic efficiency with authoritarian control. The Queen's proclamation promised an end to conquest and a commitment to the welfare of India's subjects. But in practice, British officials ruled with confidence in their own superiority. The empire had survived its greatest crisis, but at the price of trust. The partnership between Britain and India would henceforth rest not on consent, but on coercion. The decades that followed the establishment of the British Raj marked what many historians call the high noon of the British Empire. Between the 1860s and the 1880s, Britain stood at the center of a rapidly globalizing world, its influence felt from the docks of Liverpool to the rice paddies of Burma and the mines of southern Africa. It was an age of industry, communication, and confidence, an era when technology fused with imperial ambition to knit together the largest empire the world had ever seen. The British believed they had entered a new epoch of progress and civilization, a time when steam, telegraph, and finance would ensure peace through prosperity under their rule. In India, the British Crown consolidated its authority after the upheaval of the uprising. The viceroys who succeeded Lord Canning, such as Lord Lawrence and Lord Mayo, pursued a policy of reconstruction and administrative modernization. They sought to transform India from a territory of conquest into a stable, revenue-generating possession. Railways became the most visible symbol of this ambition. What had begun as a limited network under the East India Company now expanded at extraordinary speed. By the end of the century's third quarter, tens of thousands of miles of track crisscrossed the subcontinent, linking distant provinces with ports such as Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. The railways served multiple purposes. To the British, they represented progress and unity, a way of binding the vast landmass into a single economic system. To colonial administrators, they were a tool of control, allowing troops to be moved quickly in the event of unrest. For Indian merchants and farmers, the new lines offered access to distant markets but also exposure to global price fluctuations. The same trains that carried cotton to the ports during booms left the countryside vulnerable to famine when harvests failed and prices collapsed. The railways thus embodied both the promise and the peril of imperial modernization. Complementing the railway was another revolution in communication: the telegraph. Introduced in the 1850s and rapidly extended in the following decades, the telegraph connected every major city of the empire to London. Messages that once took months could now travel in hours. The completion of the submarine cable between Britain and India in 1870 made it possible for the British government to direct imperial policy in near real time. Diplomats, generals, and colonial administrators could now act in coordination as never before. The telegraph and the railway together created what one observer called the nerves and arteries of empire. They turned vast distances into manageable networks of information and transport, giving Britain an unprecedented advantage over rival powers. They also strengthened the sense, at home and abroad, that the British Empire was not merely a collection of colonies, but an integrated system, an empire of modernity sustained by science and communication. Industrial progress was not confined to India. Across the world, Britain invested heavily in infrastructure designed to serve imperial commerce. The most transformative project was the Suez Canal, completed in 1869 under French engineering but rapidly dominated by British interests. The canal cut the voyage between Europe and Asia by more than half, turning the Mediterranean into the highway of empire. Recognizing its strategic value, Britain purchased a controlling share in the canal's operating company in 1875 under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, ensuring that the route to India, the jewel in the crown, would remain secure. The canal also accelerated Britain's involvement in Egypt and the Middle East. When financial crisis struck Egypt in the late 1870s, Britain intervened to protect its investment, culminating in military occupation in 1882. This intervention signaled a new phase of imperial expansion, informal control through finance and administration, followed, when necessary, by direct rule. The Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were now effectively British lakes, patrolled by the Royal Navy and lined with coaling stations and telegraph cables. Back in Britain, these global networks fueled an extraordinary sense of national confidence. The period saw the height of Victorian imperialism, a blend of moral conviction, economic ambition, and technological optimism. Industrial output surged, exports expanded, and London became the world's financial capital. The City of London operated as the empire's economic heart, channeling investment into railways, plantations, and mines across the world. Sterling became the dominant currency of international trade, backed by the stability of the gold standard, which Britain adopted formally in 1821 and championed throughout the century. The Royal Navy ensured that the seas remained open for British commerce. Steam-powered ironclads replaced wooden sailing ships, reflecting the shift from craftsmanship to engineering. Coaling stations from Aden to Singapore supported this new generation of vessels. The empire's security no longer depended solely on armies of conquest, but on maritime logistics, the ability to move goods, messages, and people faster than any rival. Technology also reshaped the moral narrative of empire. Missionaries and reformers now saw the railway, the telegraph, and the school as instruments of enlightenment. The empire's mission, they believed, was not merely to rule, but to uplift. This sense of duty found expression in the idea of the civilizing mission, the belief that Britain was called to spread Christianity, law, and science to the world's less advanced peoples. The phrase, "the white man's burden," popularized later in the century, captured this self-image of benevolent dominion. Yet the realities of empire remained deeply unequal. Industrial capitalism demanded raw materials and markets, and colonial societies were organized to supply them. In India, peasants grew indigo, cotton, and jute for export rather than food for subsistence, making them vulnerable to global price swings. Famines in the 1860s and 70s, particularly the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, exposed the limits of imperial benevolence. Millions perished while grain was exported to sustain British profits. Similarly, in Africa and the Pacific, the advance of trade and mission often paved the way for political domination. British explorers such as David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley mapped the interior of Africa, advocating commerce and Christianity as antidotes to the slave trade. Their journeys inspired both humanitarian enthusiasm and imperial competition, setting the stage for the later scramble for Africa. Within Britain, the empire's expansion was celebrated through exhibitions, literature, and education. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace, had already displayed the industrial and imperial prowess of the nation. Later, World's Fairs and imperial exhibitions in London, Glasgow, and Manchester presented colonies as sources of exotic wealth and loyal subjects. School books taught British children that they belonged to a global family united under the crown. The empire became part of everyday imagination, a symbol of progress, order, and moral superiority. Political leadership during these decades oscillated between cautious liberalism and assertive imperialism. William Ewart Gladstone, leader of the Liberal Party, emphasized moral restraint and fiscal prudence, arguing that empire should not become a burden on taxpayers. His rival, Benjamin Disraeli, championed imperial pride and consolidation. Under his government, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, a gesture that embodied the fusion of monarchy and empire. The title affirmed that Britain's global dominion was not merely economic but also symbolic, a unity of peoples under one sovereign. The empire's structure also became more complex. Self-governing colonies such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gained increasing autonomy, developing parliamentary systems modeled on Westminster. These dominions represented one path of imperial evolution, partnership and shared identity among settler populations of European descent. In contrast, colonies in Asia and Africa remained under direct or semi-direct rule, their inhabitants treated as subjects rather than citizens. This dualism, the coexistence of freedom and subjugation, was one of the defining contradictions of the Victorian imperial system. Technological progress reinforced this hierarchy. The telegraph linked governors to London, but it also centralized authority. Decisions made in Whitehall could now be transmitted instantly across the globe, leaving little room for local discretion. Colonial administrators prided themselves on efficiency, but their systems often ignored local traditions and needs. The empire's very interconnectedness, while a marvel of engineering, made it more rigid and impersonal. Meanwhile, global trade reached unprecedented scale. Steamships carried textiles, machinery, and manufactured goods outward, while raw materials, cotton from India, tea from Ceylon, wool from Australia, and gold from South Africa, flowed back to Britain. The empire functioned as a vast economic organism sustained by industrial production and maritime transport. Insurance companies like Lloyd's and banks, such as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, founded in 1865, emerged to manage this global commerce. By the 1880s, Britain's imperial network stretched around the world, connected by telegraph wires, shipping lanes, and financial contracts. It was a system that seemed both invincible and self-sustaining, yet its very success carried the seeds of challenge. Other powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, were industrializing rapidly, eager to claim their own markets and colonies. Competition for resources and prestige would soon turn the world into a new arena of imperial rivalry. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Britain's empire stretched across the world's oceans, its dominion underpinned by technology, trade, and naval supremacy. Yet as the Victorian era advanced, a new wave of competition emerged. A race among European powers to claim and partition the last remaining regions not yet absorbed into their imperial networks. Africa, with its vast resources and strategic locations, became the principal stage of this new imperial contest. The period between the 1870s and the turn of the century came to be known as the Scramble for Africa, a term that captured both the speed and the ferocity with which Europe carved up an entire continent. For Britain, Africa had long been important but peripheral. Coastal trading posts and a few settlements, such as the Cape Colony and Sierra Leone, had served economic and naval purposes for more than a century. The abolition of the slave trade earlier in the century had given Britain a humanitarian pretext for its presence along the West African coast, where the Royal Navy patrolled against slavers. But until the mid-1870s, British policymakers largely avoided deep territorial expansion, preferring to dominate through trade and naval influence rather than conquest. That restraint began to erode as rival powers, especially France, Germany, and Belgium, moved aggressively to claim African lands. The unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck and Italy's emergence as a new state transformed the balance of power in Europe. Colonial possession became a measure of national prestige and a means to secure raw materials for industrial economies. When King Leopold II of Belgium established control over the Congo under the guise of philanthropy, Britain and France realized that inaction could mean exclusion from enormous economic potential. Economic motives played a central role. The Industrial Revolution had created an insatiable demand for rubber, copper, cotton, and other raw materials. British manufacturers sought new markets for their goods, while financiers looked for investment opportunities. Explorers and missionaries, already active across the continent, provided information that turned curiosity into ambition. Figures like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley mapped rivers, described resources, and reported on the slave trade, their writings stirring public enthusiasm and political action. The symbolic starting point of the scramble was the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, convened by Bismarck to regulate European claims in Africa and prevent conflict among imperial rivals. No African representatives were invited. The assembled powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and others, drew boundaries that bore little relation to existing ethnic or political realities. They agreed that effective occupation, not merely coastal claim, would determine sovereignty. The conference formalized a process already underway, the systematic partition of the continent. Britain entered the scramble with mixed motives and methods. Some policymakers, particularly William Gladstone, remained skeptical of imperial expansion, viewing it as costly and morally questionable. Others, like Benjamin Disraeli and later Joseph Chamberlain, saw empire as a source of strength and identity. Economic interests, missionary groups, and adventurers often acted independently of government policy, forcing London to follow where private enterprise led. In southern Africa, the discovery of diamonds in the Kimberley region in 1867 and gold in the Transvaal in 1886 transformed the region's significance. The influx of British settlers, miners, and speculators brought wealth and conflict in equal measure. The Cape Colony, under the leadership of Cecil Rhodes, became the center of Britain's southern ambitions. Rhodes, an empire builder driven by both vision and greed, dreamed of a British-controlled corridor stretching from the Cape to Cairo. His British South Africa Company, chartered in 1889, established territories that would become Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe and Zambia. Rhodes's ambitions brought Britain into confrontation with both African polities and European rivals. In the south, wars against the Zulu kingdom, the Ndebele, and the Shona peoples secured British dominance, but at enormous human cost. Further north, tensions with Portugal and Germany over territorial boundaries forced Britain into a series of diplomatic maneuvers that defined much of the continent's map. In West Africa, British interests centered on trade rather than settlement. The expansion of palm oil, cocoa, and other commodities created profitable markets that drew Britain deeper into the interior. The Royal Niger Company, led by George Goldie, operated along the Niger River, using commercial treaties and private armies to secure influence. By the 1890s, Britain had annexed large portions of modern Nigeria, transforming a patchwork of trading enclaves into a unified colonial state. Further east, the British East Africa Company extended influence along the coast of present-day Kenya and Uganda. Railways from the port of Mombasa to the interior opened new territories to British administration and missionary work. The region's highlands attracted settlers, while Lake Victoria and the Upper Nile Valley gained strategic importance as Britain sought to secure the headwaters of the Nile. Control of the Nile, vital for Egypt's irrigation and thus the Suez Canal route, became a cornerstone of imperial strategy. The competition for the Nile Valley culminated in the Fashoda Incident of 1898, when British and French forces confronted each other in Sudan. The standoff ended peacefully, with France backing down, but it revealed the global reach of European rivalries and confirmed Britain's dominance in northeastern Africa. The victory at the Battle of Omdurman the same year, in which General Herbert Kitchener defeated the Mahdist forces using modern artillery and machine guns, symbolized the technological superiority that underpinned imperial conquest. The reoccupation of Sudan completed Britain's control of the Nile from its mouth to its sources, fulfilling part of Rhodes's vision. Egypt itself, though officially part of the Ottoman Empire, had been under British military occupation since 1882. The pretext was to restore order after a nationalist uprising, but in practice, Britain controlled the government, finances, and military. Egypt became a model of informal empire, where British advisors ruled through local elites. The country's cotton production fed Lancashire's mills, while its strategic position guaranteed Britain's command of the route to India. The empire's expansion in Africa also reflected ideological shifts within Britain. The late 19th century was an era of heightened nationalism and racial theory. Social Darwinism and pseudo-scientific notions of racial hierarchy provided justification for conquest. Many Britons believed that they bore a moral responsibility to bring civilization and progress to Africa. Missionaries, teachers, and doctors accompanied soldiers and traders, founding schools and churches alongside garrisons. The language of duty masked the realities of economic exploitation and political domination. In practice, British colonial rule varied widely across the continent. In some regions, particularly West Africa, Britain favored indirect rule, governing through existing chiefs and institutions while maintaining ultimate authority. This approach, later codified by Frederick Lugard, reduced administrative costs and minimized resistance. In settler colonies like South Africa and Rhodesia, however, direct control and land seizure displaced indigenous populations and entrenched systems of racial inequality. These divergent models would shape African societies long after independence. The scramble for Africa also had profound consequences for Africans themselves. The artificial borders drawn in European capitals cut across ethnic and linguistic lines, dividing communities and forcing rival groups into single colonies. Traditional economies were disrupted as subsistence agriculture gave way to cash crop production for export. Taxation compelled Africans to enter the wage labor market, often under coercive conditions. Resistance was frequent, sometimes through open warfare, sometimes through everyday acts of defiance. Yet the imbalance of power, sustained by superior weaponry and global networks of finance, made sustained resistance difficult. At home, the British public followed these imperial adventures with fascination. Newspapers and illustrated magazines chronicled campaigns, explorers, and new territories. Heroes like Gordon of Khartoum and Kitchener were celebrated as embodiments of courage and duty. Empire became a form of popular entertainment as well as national pride. School children memorized maps painted red to show British dominions, and songs proclaimed that the sun never set on the Union Jack. Despite the triumphalism, dissenting voices persisted. Critics, such as J.A. Hobson, writing at the century's end, argued that imperial expansion served narrow financial interests rather than the nation as a whole. Humanitarian groups condemned the brutality of colonial wars and the exploitation of African labor. The exposure of atrocities in the Congo Free State, under King Leopold's personal rule, shocked even many imperialists and raised questions about the morality of empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain controlled roughly one-third of Africa's territory and a similar proportion of its population. From Egypt in the north to the Cape in the south, from Nigeria in the west to Kenya in the east, the continent had become a vast extension of Britain's global system. The continent's minerals, crops, and labor fed the industrial engine of the metropole, while its people bore the costs of conquest and control. By the final decades of the 19th century, the British Empire had reached its territorial zenith. Red patches spread across the map, spanning continents and oceans. Yet, amid this vastness, a new kind of imperial relationship was emerging, one that redefined what it meant to belong to the empire. While in Asia and Africa, Britain ruled millions of subjects through bureaucrats and armies. In the temperate lands of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, British settlers were creating self-governing societies that called themselves both British and independent. The rise of these dominions, as they came to be known, marked a fundamental shift in imperial thought. The idea that the empire could be a partnership of nations rather than a hierarchy of rulers and ruled. The story began in British North America, where tensions between English and French communities, between colonial autonomy and imperial authority, had simmered since the 18th century. The American Revolution had left Britain wary of overbearing control, and in the decades that followed, it experimented with new forms of governance. The Durham Report of 1839, written after rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, recommended responsible government. Colonies with elected assemblies that managed local affairs while the imperial government handled defense and foreign policy. This principle became the cornerstone of a new imperial model. In 1867, the British North America Act united Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick into the Dominion of Canada. The term Dominion, chosen to avoid the implication of full sovereignty, nonetheless signaled a profound change. Canada became the first self-governing polity within the empire, possessing its own parliament, prime minister, and constitution while remaining loyal to the crown. The federation reflected both pragmatism and vision. Britain secured a stable ally in North America, while Canadian leaders like John A. Macdonald and Georges Etienne Cartier sought to forge a transcontinental nation. Railway construction was central to this vision. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in the 1880s, linked the Atlantic to the Pacific, binding together distant provinces and enabling economic growth. Yet, expansion came at a cost. Indigenous peoples were displaced from ancestral lands, treaties were often ignored, and new policies of assimilation through residential schools inflicted generational trauma. For all its rhetoric of partnership, Dominion nationhood was built upon the dispossession of native populations, a pattern repeated across the empire's settler societies. In the Southern Hemisphere, similar transformations were underway. Australia, once a penal colony, had evolved into a collection of prosperous self-governing colonies. The discovery of gold in the 1850s and the growth of agriculture and trade fostered a sense of confidence and identity distinct from Britain, yet deeply tied to it. By the end of the century, calls for federation grew stronger. The 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, sought to coordinate defense, tariffs, and immigration policy. The result was the Commonwealth of Australia, established in 1901 through an act of the British Parliament. Like Canada, Australia adopted a federal constitution and a parliamentary system modeled on Westminster. The new nation retained loyalty to the Crown, but its citizens now governed themselves in nearly all domestic matters. The Federation reflected the same mixture of pride and dependency that characterized the Dominion idea, a partnership framed as equality, yet still bound by imperial allegiance. Australia's founding also revealed the racial anxieties underpinning settler nationalism. One of the first acts passed by the new Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, which laid the foundation for what became known as the White Australia Policy. This legislation aimed to preserve the colony's European identity by excluding Asian and Pacific Islander immigrants. Similar policies existed in Canada and New Zealand, where Indigenous and non-European populations were marginalized despite official rhetoric of shared citizenship. The Dominion ideal was thus inseparable from the racial hierarchies of empire. New Zealand's path to Dominion status followed a comparable trajectory, but with distinctive complexities. The signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 had established British sovereignty while promising protection to the Maori people. Over the following decades, however, land disputes and settler expansion led to wars that devastated Maori communities. By the late 19th century, New Zealand's settlers, like those in Australia, had gained self-government. In 1907, it was formally declared a dominion. Yet New Zealand's leaders cultivated a distinctive national myth, that of a harmonious partnership between Maori and Pakeha, European settlers, symbolized by shared participation in imperial wars and ceremonies. This ideal, though often at odds with reality, foreshadowed later efforts to reframe empire as a family of nations rather than an empire of subjugation. South Africa presented a far more turbulent case. British involvement there dated back to the early 19th century, but the discovery of diamonds and gold transformed the region's importance. The influx of settlers, capital, and labor led to conflict among British colonists, Afrikaner republics descended from Dutch settlers, and African kingdoms defending their lands. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and the two Boer Wars, the first in the early 1880s and the second at the century's end, revealed the brutal costs of imperial ambition. The Second Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, was especially consequential. It began as a struggle over control of mineral wealth, but became a test of imperial unity. Britain deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, many from other colonies, to suppress the Afrikaner republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The war was marked by guerrilla tactics, scorched earth policies, and the use of concentration camps where thousands of civilians died. Although Britain emerged victorious, the moral and political damage was immense. In its aftermath, British policymakers sought reconciliation through union rather than continued domination. The Union of South Africa, formed in 1910, brought together the former Boer republics and the Cape and Natal colonies into a single dominion. It joined Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as a self-governing member of the imperial family. Yet this union, too, rested on exclusion. The political settlement granted power to white settlers while denying rights to the African majority, setting the stage for the system of racial segregation that would later evolve into apartheid. The emergence of the dominions reflected both pragmatism and ideology. For Britain, granting self-government to settler colonies reduced administrative burdens and strengthened loyalty. For the settlers, dominion status offered autonomy without breaking ties to the empire. The model seemed to resolve the contradictions of imperial rule: liberty for some, stability for all. It allowed Britain to present its empire not as an instrument of coercion, but as a voluntary association of free nations united by shared values. This concept found expression in the idea of the British world, a cultural and economic network linking Britain and the dominions through trade, migration, and sentiment. Steamships and telegraphs carried news, goods, and people across the oceans, sustaining a sense of common identity. Millions emigrated from Britain to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand during this period, spreading language, customs, and institutions. In return, the dominions supplied food, wool, and minerals that fed Britain's industrial economy. The dominion model also shaped imperial defense. The rise of rival powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, prompted discussions about collective security. Conferences such as the Colonial Conference of 1887 and the Imperial Conference of 1907 explored cooperation in naval defense and foreign policy. Though the dominions resisted full military integration, they contributed troops to imperial campaigns, notably in the Sudan and South Africa. This shared sacrifice reinforced the notion of a global British partnership. Culturally, the late Victorian period celebrated Dominion nationhood as proof of Britain's civilizing mission. Writers and politicians extolled the empire as a nursery of free nations, contrasting it with the autocratic empires of continental Europe. The Queen's Jubilees in 1887 and 1902 drew representatives from across the dominions, parading loyalty and unity before the world. The empire appeared both diverse and coherent, a federation of progress and liberty under a single monarch. Yet this vision contained deep contradictions. The self-governing dominions enjoyed freedoms denied to millions of subjects in Asia and Africa. The very term British world excluded those who were not white. Economic integration favored the metropole, while cultural unity often meant assimilation to British norms. The empire of equality proclaimed from London remained an empire of hierarchy in practice. When the guns of August opened fire in 1914, the British Empire was at its territorial peak. It spanned continents, ruled over hundreds of millions of people, and dominated the seas with unmatched naval power. Yet this vast empire, which had long projected an image of unshakable stability, was now drawn into a conflict that would test the very foundations of its global supremacy. The First World War, known at the time simply as the Great War, was more than a European confrontation. It was an imperial war that mobilized men, resources, and loyalties from every corner of Britain's dominions and colonies. The outbreak of war came amid a web of alliances and rivalries that had been building for decades. Britain's commitment to defend Belgium's neutrality, guaranteed by treaty since the early 19th century, brought it into direct conflict with Germany after the invasion of August 4, 1914. The empire's participation, however, was not merely a matter of honor. It was also a defense of Britain's position as the preeminent global power. Germany's industrial growth and naval expansion had challenged British dominance, and the war became a struggle to maintain the balance of power in Europe and the empire's security overseas. From the first days of the conflict, the British government understood that victory would depend on imperial resources. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, rallied to the cause with remarkable enthusiasm. Their parliaments declared war alongside Britain, and volunteers enlisted by the tens of thousands. In India, leaders of the newly emerging nationalist movement set aside their grievances to demonstrate loyalty, hoping that wartime service might earn greater autonomy in the future. The scale of imperial mobilization was unprecedented. From the Indian subcontinent alone, more than 1 million soldiers served overseas. Indian regiments fought in France, Mesopotamia, and East Africa, enduring conditions that tested endurance and faith. Canadian troops distinguished themselves at battles such as Ypres and Vimy Ridge. Australian and New Zealand forces fought in the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign of 1915, where heavy losses forged powerful national memories. African and Caribbean soldiers, too, were conscripted or volunteered for service, though often relegated to labor battalions or support roles under discriminatory treatment. The war transformed the nature of imperial relations. For the first time, the Dominions operated as semi-independent partners within a global military effort. They raised their own armies, managed supply chains, and coordinated with Britain as allies rather than subordinates. Their sacrifices gave substance to the rhetoric of shared destiny that had long surrounded the imperial project. Yet the same experience also fostered a sense of distinct national identity. The cemeteries at Vimy Ridge, Gallipoli, and Delville Wood became sacred ground not only to the empire, but to the emerging nations within it. Britain's colonies provided not just manpower but also essential material support. India supplied food, textiles, and financial credit. Egypt and Mesopotamia became key theaters of war in the Middle East, where British forces fought the Ottoman Empire for control of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf. African colonies contributed laborers and soldiers in campaigns against German territories such as Tanganyika and Cameroon. The global nature of the conflict underscored how deeply the empire's fortunes were tied to its far-flung possessions. At home, the war placed immense strain on Britain's economy and society. The demands of total war required vast mobilization of industry, finance, and agriculture. The Royal Navy enforced a blockade against Germany while German submarines threatened Britain's supply lines. To maintain production, the government introduced unprecedented state intervention, rationing, price controls, and labor regulation. The war also accelerated technological innovation, from tanks to aircraft, reflecting the same industrial ingenuity that had once driven imperial expansion. Politically, the war reshaped Britain's relationship with its dominions and colonies. In 1917, Prime Minister David Lloyd George convened the Imperial War Conference, which brought together leaders from across the empire to discuss strategy and post-war reconstruction. The conference marked a recognition that the empire was no longer a monolithic entity directed from London, but a federation of partners whose cooperation was vital. The Dominion's prime ministers, such as Robert Borden of Canada and William Hughes of Australia, asserted their right to shape policy and to sit as equals in any post-war peace conference. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Britain's wartime policies laid the groundwork for future conflict. In its struggle against the Ottoman Empire, Britain supported the Arab Revolt, promising independence to Arab leaders such as Sharif Hussein of Mecca in return for their support. At the same time, secret agreements such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the region into British and French spheres of influence. These contradictory promises would cast a long shadow over the 20th century, as borders drawn by imperial diplomacy replaced older political identities. In India, the war initially strengthened the bond between ruler and ruled. The Indian National Congress, under leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Mohandas Gandhi, urged cooperation, hoping that loyal service would lead to self-government after victory. Yet the human and economic cost of the war, rising taxes, food shortages, and inflation soon bred resentment. The expectations of post-war reform would ignite the next phase of the independence movement. The war's global scale also drew Britain deeper into Africa and Asia. British forces captured Germany's colonies in Africa, including Southwest Africa and East Africa, often with the help of African porters and soldiers whose sacrifices went largely unrecognized. In the Pacific, Australian and New Zealand troops seized German possessions, extending their reach across the ocean. The empire grew even as the war consumed its wealth. As casualties mounted, millions dead and wounded, the moral and psychological toll became immense. The ideal of the empire as a civilizing force was difficult to reconcile with the mechanized slaughter of the Western Front. Yet imperial propaganda emphasized unity and purpose. Posters and newspapers depicted the war as a family effort of free nations and loyal subjects defending civilization against barbarism. This narrative masked inequalities in pay, recognition, and treatment, but sustained morale across the empire. The armistice of November 11, 1918 ended the fighting, but the peace that followed would reveal deep tensions. At the Paris Peace Conference, Britain and its dominions sat as separate delegations, reflecting their growing autonomy. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa signed the Treaty of Versailles in their own right and joined the new League of Nations as individual members. This symbolic recognition of nationhood marked a turning point in the evolution of the empire toward a commonwealth of nations. Yet the post-war settlement also extended British power in new ways. Under the League's system of mandates, Britain received control over former German and Ottoman territories, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, Tanganyika, and parts of the Pacific. These were presented as trusts for the advancement of their peoples, but in practice, they operated as colonies under another name. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent, even as its cohesion began to fray. The war had changed everything. Economically, Britain emerged victorious but heavily indebted, particularly to the United States. The costs of maintaining global commitments now strained national finances. Socially, the war had accelerated change. Women entered the workforce, labor movements gained strength, and public expectations of reform grew. Politically, the Dominion's wartime sacrifices gave them confidence to demand greater independence, while colonial subjects questioned the empire's moral authority. The aftermath also revealed the contradictions of imperial idealism. In Ireland, nationalist forces launched the War of Independence in 1919, leading to the eventual partition of the island. In India, peaceful protests against repressive wartime legislation culminated in tragedy at Amritsar in 1919, when British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians. These events exposed the limits of Britain's promises of liberty and justice. The Great War thus marked both the high point and the beginning of decline for the British Empire. It demonstrated the empire's capacity to mobilize global power, but also exposed its vulnerabilities. The myth of unity gave way to a new reality of competing nationalisms within Britain's dominions, among its colonial subjects, and even at home. The end of the Great War left the British Empire at once triumphant and troubled. On maps, it appeared larger than ever, its dominions and colonies stretching over vast regions of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The old empires of Germany and the Ottomans had been dismantled, and Britain had inherited many of their territories under the new League of Nations mandate system. Yet beneath this surface of grandeur, deep currents of change were reshaping the imperial world. New nationalisms, economic crises, and ideological challenges questioned the very legitimacy of empire. The 2 decades between the armistice of 1918 and the outbreak of the Second World War became a period of reflection, reform, and resistance. An age in which the British Empire tried to reinvent itself for a modern world, but found that the forces it had unleashed were already moving beyond its control. Britain emerged from the First World War exhausted and indebted. The war had cost millions of lives and drained the treasury. Industrial production had slowed, and the nation now owed vast sums, particularly to the United States. The empire that had once financed itself through trade and investment was suddenly dependent on foreign credit. Maintaining the world's largest navy, garrisons across 5 continents, and new mandates in the Middle East and Africa placed unprecedented strain on the imperial budget. At the same time, expectations among Britain's subjects had changed. The rhetoric of the war, fought, as leaders claimed, for freedom and democracy, had inspired hopes for self-determination. United States President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, with their promise of national self-rule, resonated far beyond Europe. Peoples under colonial rule listened closely and asked whether these ideals applied to them. The British government faced a dilemma: how to preserve imperial unity while acknowledging the growing demand for autonomy. In the Dominions, wartime sacrifice had already laid the groundwork for greater independence. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had fought as partners rather than subordinates, and their leaders now demanded recognition. The Imperial Conference of 1926, led by British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, produced the Balfour Declaration, not to be confused with the earlier one concerning Palestine, which defined the Dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status and in no way subordinate to one another. This statement codified the idea of a commonwealth of nations, a voluntary association bound by allegiance to the crown rather than legal subordination. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 gave this principle legal form. It granted legislative equality to the Dominions, allowing them to pass their own laws without reference to Westminster. This transformation marked the culmination of a century-long evolution from colony to nation. By the mid-1930s, the Dominions were effectively self-governing states, united by history, culture, and defense, rather than by coercion. In India, however, the process of reform took a very different path. The end of the war had raised expectations of progress toward self-rule, but the British response was cautious and contradictory. The Government of India Act of 1919, often called the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, introduced a limited system of diarchy, dividing authority between British officials and Indian ministers. While Indians gained control over certain areas such as education and health, the British retained power over defense, finance, and foreign affairs. The reforms satisfied few. Nationalists in the Indian National Congress, now led by Mahatma Gandhi, demanded full self-government, or Swaraj. Gandhi, drawing on principles of nonviolence and mass mobilization, transformed the nationalist movement into a broad-based campaign that reached peasants, workers, and women. His leadership in the non-cooperation movement of the early 1920s marked a new phase of resistance, moral, disciplined, and rooted in Indian traditions of protest. The British response was often repressive. The massacre at Amritsar in 1919, when troops under General Dyer fired upon an unarmed crowd, shocked the world and destroyed what remained of trust in British rule. Yet even as repression intensified, the government introduced further constitutional reforms. The Simon Commission of 1927 and the Government of India Act of 1935 proposed expanded provincial autonomy and the eventual creation of a federation. However, these measures came too late to quell the rising tide of nationalism. Beyond India, Britain's new territories in the Middle East presented both opportunity and turmoil. Under the League of Nations mandates, Britain governed Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, ostensibly preparing them for eventual independence. In practice, these territories became vital strategic zones linking the Mediterranean to India and the Persian Gulf. In Iraq, nationalist uprisings in 1920 forced Britain to reconsider direct rule. The creation of a nominally independent monarchy under British guidance represented a compromise, an example of indirect control cloaked in sovereignty. In Palestine, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising a Jewish national home, collided with the aspirations of the Arab majority. British officials struggled to reconcile incompatible promises to Jews and Arabs, sowing tensions that would endure for generations. In Africa, the interwar period brought both consolidation and unrest. British administrators emphasized indirect rule, governing through local chiefs and traditional structures. This system, championed by Frederick Lugard, reduced costs and appeared to respect indigenous customs, but it also froze existing hierarchies and limited political development. Economic exploitation continued through mining, agriculture, and labor migration. Resistance movements emerged in Nigeria, Kenya, and the Gold Coast, where educated elites began to articulate early forms of African nationalism. The interwar years also saw major shifts in imperial economics. Britain remained committed to free trade, but competition from the United States, Germany, and Japan eroded its industrial advantage. The empire increasingly functioned as a closed economic bloc, known as imperial preference, where goods from within the Commonwealth received favorable tariffs. The goal was to stabilize trade and employment, yet the policy also deepened economic dependence between Britain and its colonies. The Great Depression of 1929 struck the empire with devastating force. Falling prices for raw materials crippled colonial economies dependent on exports. In the Caribbean, poverty and unemployment led to strikes and protests. In Africa and Asia, declining commodity prices intensified hardship and discontent. The economic crisis forced Britain to reconsider its responsibilities toward its colonies. Commissions and reports recommended social and economic development, laying the groundwork for later welfare-oriented colonial policies. In Britain itself, the Depression fueled political and ideological debates about the meaning of empire. Some, like Winston Churchill, continued to view it as the foundation of British greatness. Others, particularly in the Labour Party, began to question the morality and cost of colonialism. Intellectuals and writers, from George Orwell to E.M. Forster, offered critical portrayals of imperial life, exposing its hypocrisies and contradictions. The interwar years were also a time of profound cultural change within the empire. The dominions asserted their distinct identities through literature, art, and foreign policy. Canada established its own diplomatic corps. Australia and New Zealand developed distinct voices in Pacific affairs. The shared experience of war had created pride in national achievement, but also a growing sense of divergence from Britain. In India, the nationalist movement entered a new phase. Gandhi's Salt March of 1930 was both a protest against imperial taxation and a symbolic assertion of self-reliance. The image of the frail, determined leader marching to the sea to make salt from the waters of his own land captured imaginations around the world. Britain's imprisonment of Gandhi and other leaders only strengthened their cause. The Indian National Congress, now a mass organization, demanded not reforms, but independence. Elsewhere in Asia, similar movements stirred. In Burma, nationalist monks and students challenged British rule. In Ceylon, constitutional reforms expanded limited self-government. In the Middle East, Egypt gained formal independence in 1922, though British troops remained to protect the Suez Canal. Across the empire, the language of nationalism began to eclipse that of loyalty. The interwar decades were marked by global ideological conflict between liberal democracy, fascism, and communism. These new ideologies posed challenges to imperial legitimacy. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany denounced the hypocrisy of British liberalism while seeking empires of their own. The Soviet Union appealed to anti-colonial movements, portraying itself as the champion of oppressed peoples. Britain responded by emphasizing gradual reform and the supposed benevolence of its rule, presenting the empire as a force for stability in a dangerous world. At the same time, new forms of communication, radio, film, and print, transformed imperial propaganda. The British Broadcasting Corporation and the Empire Marketing Board promoted images of unity and prosperity. Posters urged Britons to buy empire goods, while documentaries celebrated the wonders of modernity and the loyalty of colonial subjects. Yet behind these glossy images, the empire's contradictions were increasingly visible. Prosperity for some, poverty for others, promises of freedom alongside realities of subjugation. By the late 1930s, the fragile balance of the interwar empire was breaking down. The rise of Nazi Germany and militarist Japan posed direct threats to British interests. The empire's global commitments now appeared dangerously overstretched. In Asia, Japan's expansion into China and the Pacific challenged Britain's position in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya. In Europe, the looming threat of war forced Britain to divert resources from imperial defense to home rearmament. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 found the empire once again at a crossroads. Its dominions rallied to the cause as they had in 1914, but this time they did so as independent nations within a commonwealth. India's leaders, however, demanded a clear promise of post-war independence before offering support. The empire that entered the war was no longer united by unquestioned loyalty. It was bound by necessity, its cohesion tested by the pressures of modern nationalism and global conflict. The interwar period thus marked the beginning of the end of Britain's traditional empire. It was an age of transition, from dominance to negotiation, from hierarchy to partnership, from imperial certainty to moral doubt. The old order, built on conquest and commerce, was giving way to a new world of nations demanding equality. Britain still claimed to lead a global community, but its authority was no longer absolute. The story continues in Section 19, World War II and the Unraveling, 1939 to 1947.